Book 1, Chapter 48 Trap. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The blue skies were clear and devoid of all clouds, but sand continued to descend upon the world like snow. The golden rays of the fiery sun filled the wastelands with light, causing the grit to crackle and pop under the heat. The brutal heat baked the ground so much that cracks could be seen everywhere. The searing heat of the sun was many times more intense than it had been during the old times. The vast majority of the creatures who had lived in the old times would be unable to survive such temperatures, but those weaker creatures had long ago been transformed into dusty, dry bones. The only creatures who could survive were those who had already adapted to this new, brutal environment. Mad Dog let out a bestial howl as he swung his two machetes. Two of the giant rats next to him were instantly chopped in half, and a large amount of foul, corrupted blood sprayed out of their bodies. Right after he had dealt with these two, another one suddenly charged towards him. Mad Dog dodged sideways, avoiding the giant rat's furious charge. Cloudhawk seized the moment to nimbly charge forwards, giving the giant rat no time to flee as he thrust his tri-bladed staff into its head. Careful! Another acid rat. Cook led the Bigfoot cavalry in a hasty retreat from the front lines, a large group of giant rats chasing behind them. One of the rats looked somewhat smaller, but it was rounder and its skin looked an oily green color. Anyone who took a closer look at the rats would be able to notice that it looked rather different. Acid rats were a type of special mutated rat. They contained numerous acid sacs inside their body, and they normally would slowly build up and store powerful acid within those sacs. When they needed to fight, they would be able to spit acid up to several meters at their targets. The worst thing was that not only did they have acid sacs in their bodies, their skin was covered with large amounts of acid as well. Any ordinary weapon used to stab one of them would be instantly corroded and rendered useless, and the acidic blood spraying from the wound would also be enough to cause enormous harm to anyone splashed by it. One of their iron hedgehogs had been ruined yesterday by one of these creatures. PFF, PFF. Two globes of acid came flying towards them. Cloudhawk and Mad Dog hurriedly dodged, and the two giant rats they had slain just moments ago were hit head-on by the acid. Their tough fur and flesh quickly began to steam and hiss as it melted into a puddle of bile, leaving only the bones behind, but a few moments later, even the bones started to melt. Mad Dog howled, "Kill it, quick!" Cloudhawk switched the tri-blade staff from his right hand to his left hand, then pulled out his revolver. Just as the acid rat was about to attack a second time, Cloudhawk shot it straight in the mouth. This was a lethal strike. The creature instantly slumped to the ground, its entire body starting to dissolve as the acid began to pool around it and corrode a hole into the ground. Now that the acid rat was dead, Mad Dog had nothing else to worry about. His machetes rose and fell as though he was chopping vegetables, and he instantly chopped 4 of those enormous rats into mincemeat. Woola came bounding over as well to help out, and soon the giant rats were finally and completely disposed of. Cloudhawk wiped the blood off of his tri-bladed staff. As he was doing so, Cook came riding over on his Bigfoot bird. "Slyfox found a cave for us. We've already swept the perimeter clean. We can go hide there for now." Mad Dog and Cloudhawk followed Cook towards the cave. It had been a vicious battle, and a number of them had been injured. The mercenary company looked a bit bedraggled. Mad Dog's irascible temper had been thoroughly aroused. He crushed a large rock to pieces beneath his boot, then began to curse loudly. The mission report was complete bullshit. They estimated around 200 rats, but there has to be at least 500 of the little fuckers. Not only were these giant rats tough to deal with, there were several times as many of them as had been reported. Right now, they couldn't even be sure as to exactly how many of the creatures existed. Rather tired, Cloudhawk slumped against the entrance to the cave as he inspected his revolver. He had used up a total of 3 bullets. He reloaded the revolver, then reholstered it by his waist. This location offered them a good vantage point, allowing them to clearly see everything in the area off to a distance of 10 kilometers. From here, the ruins in this place looked like giant centipedes that squiggled in the ground, forming a large number of squat mountain ridges. From here, he could see a large number of strange buildings and destroyed statues. One squat mountain was particularly eye-catching. It looked almost as though it had been sliced through by an enormous shearing knife, leaving behind a smooth, slick surface on top. However, right on top of it there was a sharp pyramid that was roughly 10 or so meters long that grew out of the mountain in a strange manner. The metallic pyramid had been severely corroded. In both material and form, it looked very different from the other buildings of the old times. It looked more like it had been created in another world and planted here. Weird, right? The bear-sized Cook walked over to Cloud Hawk. This place is a classic example of dimensionally overlapping. Supposedly, long ago our worlds suddenly began to suffer from dimensional overlapping for some strange reason. The clash of dimensions resulted in the destruction of the old civilization and changed our world. All sorts of strange things were brought into our world. That thing over there. It's a good example of something from another world. That's why it looks so bizarre. How do you even know these things? Cloud Hawk looked skeptically at the man. You are just making this stuff up. Bah. 2 years ago, when I was out on a mission, I encountered a bunch of weirdos who called themselves Seekers. They were the ones who told me all this. Hell, I don't know if any of it is true either. Cook lit a cigarette as he sat down, then offered one to Cloud Hawk as well. World's gone to shit. Doesn't really matter, I suppose. Sig. Cloud Hawk now had a little more experience than before. This time, he took a much smaller puff on the cigarette but he still ended up coughing a few times. Seekers. What are seekers? No clue. Bunch of crazy dudes that spend all their searching for the truth and the answer. All they want is to bring back the civilization and the technology that was lost to us ages ago. Still, they seem to be pretty influential in the wastelands. Cook shook his head, then tossed another canteen over to Cloud Hawk. You'll find all sorts of weirdos in the wastelands. Nothing to be surprised over. True. Nothing to be surprised over. Cloud Hawk took a sniff, first verifying that it was water before he took a large gulp from the canteen. A cool, refreshing feeling permeated his body. Come to think of it, you didn't do half bad just now. I didn't expect that you could fight, kid. Cloud Hawk responded rather irritably, you guys spent a month beating the shit out of me every day. Is it really that surprising that I learned a few tricks? Cook began to roar with laughter. Not bad, kid. You hid it from everyone. Let's spar a bit once we get back home. Cloud Hawk snorted. I'll knock your teeth out. That's a pretty ballsy claim. I'll remember it. Everyone, gather around. Sly Fox summoned everyone to him, then proclaimed. This mission is more complicated than we expected. We have no idea how many rats there are, but judging from the current situation there has to be at least 500 of the little bastards. This place is too big, there's no way for us to scout out the entire place. The mercenaries began to mutter and curse. Mad Dog said irritably, then have you come up with an idea? You can't seriously expect us to fight against this many giant rats. Sly Fox was the first captain of the Tartarus mercenaries, and he was also their principal mastermind. Generally speaking, it was his job to find solutions to any thorny problems they encountered. A very stupid idea. A stupid idea. There are 20.5 of us. So long as we can avoid fighting more than 40 of those giant rats at once, and so long as we can avoid making any major mistakes, we won't suffer any casualties in battle. Sly Fox hesitated a few seconds, then continued. I've already scanned the local area. There's a couple of flat-topped mountains in the area around us with very few places for the rats to hide. We still have plenty of water, and we can eat most of the ordinary giant rats. In my opinion, we can fight and win a war of attrition against them. Starting now, we aren't going to go any deeper into this place. The only thing we're gonna do is hunt down small packs of those giant rats. If we encounter large swarms of them, we'll figure out a way to split them up and then trap them in batches. We'll slowly wipe them all out in a safe, stable manner as we advance, and in the end, we'll find that Rat King. So the plan was for them to slowly wipe out the rats through attrition. After they killed a few hundred of the critters, they would then come up with a way to kill the Rat King. This really was a pretty stupid idea. But, it also was a potentially effective one. Cloudhawk let out a yawn. It looked like they were going to be busy. The Tartarus mercenaries were elite Wastelander warriors. Each of them had their own unique skills, giving them tremendous power and flexibility as a group. Sly Fox made a few special arrangements, then ordered the entire company to begin to move. Doviko Woola was given a very important task. They were going to depend on his sense of smell to find the various rat packs, while the mercenaries would then bait the ones they found into traps and wipe them out in batches. By the end of the day, they had slain over 100 of the giant rats. The total value of that much rat meat alone was quite significant. As for the mercenaries, they had suffered no casualties at all. This was an absolutely dazzling achievement. They continued with the program the next day. However, Cloudhawk noticed that the number of giant rats in the area had noticeably lessened. By nightfall, they had only killed around 50 of the giant rats, and by the third day, there were virtually no giant rats to be found anywhere. The mercenaries were all rather puzzled. Still, they didn't spend too much time pondering this. Most likely, these giant rats were territorial in nature. After they wiped out all the giant rats in one area, the giant rats in the other areas wouldn't immediately come pouring in, resulting in an empty region for a period of time. This actually wasn't that uncommon in the wastelands. Since they had already wiped out the giant rats in this area, the mercenaries decided that they would begin to slowly wipe out the rats in the surrounding areas as well. Woola. Cloudhawk had Woola on the leash. Woola was running up ahead while the 20+ mercenaries were moving through the exposed parts of the wastelands. Woola spent more than an hour running forwards before he suddenly came to a halt in front of a valley, then began to bray and bark towards it. There's a small group of giant rats up ahead. Cloudhawk wore a pair of protective goggles and had swathed his face in cloth. His shotgun was on his back, his staff was in his right hand, and he was dressed in leather armor. He rather looked like a proper mercenary right now. There are roughly 20 to 30 of them. Mad Dog didn't even hesitate. Then what are we waiting for? Let's go in and wipe him out. Cloudhawk gave the gorge another glance. It looked very dark and narrow. For some reason, he had a bad feeling about this place. Something feels off. Mad Dog didn't understand what Cloudhawk was saying. Woola's sense of smell is never wrong. The four of you, wait here. Report back immediately if something happens. Sly Fox also trusted Woola's judgment, but his cautious nature led him to leave behind 4 mercenaries to stand guard. We'll go in and deal with them as quickly as we can. 20 or 30 giant rats were nothing to this group of crack mercenaries. This gorge was extremely dark, narrow, and deep. As Cloudhawk followed the mercenaries in, the bad feeling in his heart only grew stronger and stronger. He had the nagging feeling that something was wrong, but was unable to put his finger on it. Finally, they reached the deepest depths of the gorge. What the hell is going on? Mad Dog stared at the empty gorge, his hideous black face twisting into a scowl. Did Woola really fuck up? The region was completely empty. The ground was covered in rubble, and there was nowhere else to go. Not a single giant rat was to be seen everywhere. This made no sense. Cloudhawk suddenly saw something in front of him. He immediately charged forwards, using his staff to bash aside a few rocks. When he saw what lay hidden underneath the rocks, his face instantly turned white. The other mercenaries crowded around to take a look. When they saw it, strange looks appeared on their faces as well, because a large pile of rat hair and rat dung could be seen beneath the rocks. Woola's nose had been functioning perfectly. These things had been left buried no more than a few hours ago at most. Even Sly Fox and Mad Dog stared jaws agape at this strange sight. Cook, however, didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. The burly mercenary actually began to roar with laughter. "Are you shitting me? Don't tell me that these giant rats set a trap for us, that they schemed to trick us into this place." Ahahaha, but just a heartbeat later, he stopped laughing, because he realized that no one else was laughing with him. He felt quite awkward. Cloudhawk wasn't amused in the slightest. Instead, he felt a cold chill go down his spine. Although he had experienced countless terrors during the past 2 months, this time was different. A strange, terrifying thought was floating through his mind. Did these damn rats really set up a trap, and succeed in tricking humans into falling for it? Book 1, Chapter 41. In the Face of Death. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Cloudhawk's thoughts were slowly being consumed by this terrifying possibility. Had the giant rats been spying on the mercenaries during the past few days? Had they first gotten a handle on how the mercenaries were behaving, then set a special trap to wipe them all out in one go? Impossible. He had to be imagining things. This idea was shocking, ridiculous, impossible, and unbelievable. But when Cloudhawk took another glance at the rat hair, then at the local geography, he couldn't help but turn even paler. The only way the little bastards could have set up a trap like this was if they were almost as intelligent as human beings. Giant rats were amongst the lowest type of mutabeasts in existence. In both the old times and in the modern era, they were at the very bottom of the food chain. Cloudhawk refused to believe that rats could come up with a scheme like this. This entire world has gone mad. The unsteady look on Sly Fox's face suggested that he had the same thoughts as Cloudhawk, even though neither voiced them. Still, Sly Fox was a very experienced man who had encountered many dangerous events in his life. He didn't hesitate in the slightest as he immediately called out, "Withdraw." Everyone came back to their senses. Right at this moment, a series of noises could be heard from the entrance to the valley. A pair of gunshots could be heard, followed by miserable screams. The mercenaries stationed outside were in trouble. Mad Dog immediately ordered, "Cook, Woola, go take a look." Woola was the fastest member of the mercenary squad, his 6 legs allowing him to bound forward with the speed of a cyclone. Right behind him were 8 Wastelander cavalrymen riding their Bigfoot birds, with the other mercenaries frantically running towards the entrance to the gorge. That uneasy feeling in Cloudhawk's mind grew stronger and stronger. Something really bad was going to happen. Just a few minutes later, Woola came bounding backwards. His body was covered with wounds, and only 6 of the 8 mercenary cavalry came back, with Cook supporting an injured one. The injured cavalryman's chest was torn apart with bite marks, and it looked as though they had chewed their way into his innards. The most deadly wound was the one on his neck, where it looked as though his carotid artery had been severed. "I need a medic." Several mercenaries frantically ran over, wanting to help, but the man's injuries were catastrophic. There was no way to stop the bleeding, and blood continued to spew out of him. He struggled to open his eyes, then reached out with a mangled hand to weakly clasp a nearby mercenary. He summoned all of the energy he had to say, "We're completely surrounded outside. I'm not gonna make it. Leave me and get the hell out of." Right at this moment, a tidal wave of strange squeaks suddenly rang out from outside. These were the sounds the giant rats made, and it seemed as though there were countless rats right outside. The mercenaries all felt as though they had been doused in cold water as the final strand of hope they had felt was extinguished. What the hell is going on? The furious Mad Dog charged straight towards Cook, grabbing him roughly. "Where are the others? What happened to the others?" Cook just shook his head, a bitter look on his face. Just as Mad Dog was about to launch into an enraged tirade, the worst-case scenario happened. A large number of giant rats began to flood into the gorge, surging towards them like a tide. Some were burrowing under the ground while some were crawling on the walls. There had to be at least 500 or 600 of the critters at a minimum. Damn! This is almost as bad as a beast wave. Although the mercenaries were quite powerful, how could they possibly deal with such a large scale attack by so many giant rats? The mercenaries began to withdraw, not even thinking about stopping to fight. Sly Fox moved to grab the heavily injured cavalryman, only to discover that he had already passed away just a short while ago. The countless giant rats around them continued to surge closer and closer towards them. Screw it, withdraw. 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 The 20+ mercenaries all began to frantically retreat. While withdrawing, Cloudhawk stared wide-eyed as the dead mercenary on the ground was dragged like a ragdoll into an entire pack of savage giant rats. It was like he had been dragged into the hands of a horde of murderous children, and just a few seconds later the corpse had been completely torn apart. Cloudhawk had spent roughly a month and a half at Black Flag Outpost. By now, he knew and was very familiar with every single mercenary in the Tartarus Mercenary Company. They loved to tease and torment him, and now, one of them had just died in front of Cloudhawk, with his body torn into shreds. Cloudhawk couldn't help but feel miserable. Although he still really didn't like Black Flag Outpost, he had to admit that he truly had become a member of the mercenary company. One of his comrades had just died in front of him, and there hadn't been a thing he could do about it. This induced a sensation of rage and grief as he powerlessly tightened his grasp around the black tri-bladed staff. Cloudhawk's eyes were completely bloodshot by now. Right at this moment, one of the dog-sized giant rats pounced straight towards him, its mutated claws and fangs as sharp as knives. These creatures were incredibly deadly. If he allowed himself to be knocked down, he would be doomed. Cloudhawk lashed out with his staff, and the blood-splattered giant rat came crashing down to the ground. Alas, the creature was incredibly tough and tenacious. Although it had been heavily injured, it didn't retreat. Instead, it moved to attack in an even more berserk fashion. Right at this moment, 2 more giant rats appeared next to Cloudhawk. They were as agile as panthers and as savage as wolves, launching a pincer attack on Cloudhawk. Fuck off. Cloudhawk brandished his tri-blade staff, managing to just barely beat back 2 of the rats. The third one managed to make it past his defenses, leaping onto Cloudhawk and pouncing onto him, using its hooked claws to dig an enormous tear on the back of Cloudhawk's leather armor. Cloudhawk spun his tri-blade staff backwards, using it to stab towards his own back. Several bloody wounds appeared on the giant rat's body, but it continued to obstinately maintain its grip on Cloudhawk. It even attempted to climb upwards and tear at Cloudhawk's neck. Right at this critical moment, the 6-armed Woola came charging over. Woola grabbed the giant rat, threw it to the ground, then delivered a crushing bite to the giant rat's head. Let's run, Woola. Cloudhawk stabbed to death a giant rat which sought to ambush Woola. The creature's foul, pungent blood spurted onto his face, but he didn't even have any time to wipe it off. They were completely surrounded by giant rats, all of which were leaping towards them. Crack! 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 3 cracks rang out as Sly Fox turned to fire off 3 shots in their direction. 3 of the giant rats toppled to the ground. Cloudhawk and Woola hurriedly took advantage of the opening to follow after the rest of the mercenaries. Don't panic, rookies. Don't panic. All of you, stay close to me. Sly Fox fired repeated long-distance shots, killing several of the deadly acid rats which were hidden amongst the many other giant rats. Cook's up ahead searching for a place for us to hide. Mad Dog was like a windmill meat grinder, swinging his snow-white machetes in every direction as he hacked open a path for the others. It didn't matter how ferocious the giants' rat were or how many of them attacked, all of them were hacked into mincemeat by Mad Dog's deadly dance of machetes. Several of the Wastelander cavalry on the Bigfoot birds led the vanguard in their breakout attempt. Cook led them through various twists and turns, somehow actually managing to discover a cave. "There's a cave up ahead. Quick, into the cave." The mercenaries fought their way all the way to the cave entrance. The cave was large enough for the mercenaries to hide themselves in. If they barricaded themselves inside and just defended the entrance, their chances for survival would be exponentially higher. Just as the mercenaries were about to go into the cave, 5 particularly muscular giant rats came flying out from inside the cave. The vermin had actually set up a small ambush for them. However, there weren't enough of the rats to actually pose a danger to the mercenaries. Grah! Mad Dog was like a maddened beast as he hacked all of the nearby giant rats into tiny pieces. Just as Mad Dog chopped the final giant rat apart, one final rat came bounding towards them from within the darkness. Without even pausing to think, Mad Dog moved to chop this rat apart as well. Slyfox's eyes widened as he stared at the giant rat from afar. He let out a loud roar, "Blast rat! Dodge it!" This giant rat was smaller than most giant rats, but its fur was completely red. Under ordinary lighting, it would have stood out quite easily. Much like the acid rats, blast rats were a special type of mutant rats. They weren't large, but their bodies contained an enormous amount of explosive materials inside. If it suddenly exploded, not only would Mad Dog and the surrounding mercenaries be caught in the blast, even the very cave itself would be collapsed. Without the protection of the cave, the mercenaries would be doomed. They'd be swamped and torn to bits by this endless wave of giant rats. Doomed. We're doomed. It's too late. But right at this critical moment, an incredibly agile black shadow shot forwards, using its mouth to bite down on the blast rat. The black shadow's 6 arms propelled it outwards at incredible speeds as it instantly charged outside of the cave. Cloudhawk shouted loudly, "Danger! Get back here!" Woola shook his powerful head, sending the blast rat flying into the air, but it suddenly detonated just a second later. The rat had flown less than 2 meters away before exploding, and it was like a grenade had detonated. An enormous ball of light and fire burst out with terrible power, blasting a crater into the ground. As for Woola, he was blown backwards by the force of the collision and knocked sprawling to the ground. His 6 arms twitched spasmodically, but he was unable to clamber back to his feet. Clearly, this wound was an extremely heavy one. Woola! Cloudhawk's eyes instantly reddened. Cook hurriedly moved forwards to grab him and stop him from moving. "Don't be rash." Unexpectedly, Cloudhawk was so strong that Cook wasn't able to grab a hold of him. Cloudhawk ran forwards in a near-hysterical manner, his steel staff knocking aside 5 giant rats that were about to attack Woola. Several of the giant rats had torn multiple gaping wounds in his body. By now, the 10+ nearby giant rats had already completely focused their attention upon him and Woola. Slyfox raised his guns up high. The sound of gunfire rang out unabated, causing one giant rat after another to fall down. Alas, more of the giant rats quickly charged forwards to surround Cloudhawk once more. The sound of gunfire and bowstrings twanging could be heard. Thanks to the screening fire provided by the mercenaries, Cloudhawk finally managed to drag Woola back into the cave, his own body now covered with wounds. Slyfox roared angrily towards Cloudhawk, "Are you mad? That was suicidal." Cloudhawk turned to glare right back at Slyfox, his eyes still crimson. "I had to save Woola." Even Slyfox was stunned by what he saw in Cloudhawk's eyes. However, he quickly recovered. Mad Dog blocked them at the entranceway. "Everyone else, help out." Everyone frantically ran over to inspect Woola and see if they could treat his wounds, and their faces quickly turned grim. Woola's injuries were absolutely grievous. Woola's head had suffered the brunt of the explosion, and half of his face was missing. One of his eyes was gone, as were 2 of his legs. They could even see his open, exposed skull. Woola was furiously panting for breath, but it was clear that he was at the verge of death. The mercenaries had raised Woola since he was young. He was a human, but was so highly mutated that there was no difference between him and a wild animal. They normally treated him as nothing more than a guard dog, but in their hearts Woola was an inseparable member of the Tartarus mercenaries. Woola was an ugly, savage, bloodthirsty cannibal, but when the mercenaries were in danger, he had ignored his own safety and charged out to protect them. He had traded away his own life to give them a chance to live. He was nothing more than a wild animal, but he was far better than many humans of this day and age. Cloudhawk wanted to help Woola, but had no idea as to what he could do. "Hang on, Woola. Where's the medicine? I need medicine. We need to treat Woola." But the only response was silence. The mercenaries sighed silently. As for Woola, he opened his remaining eye and let out a low, mournful gurgle. Right at this moment, Sly Fox walked over to Cloudhawk, then pulled out a dagger and tossed it to him. Cloudhawk stared at Sly Fox in disbelief, then glanced at Woola. "What are you saying? Woola's in a lot of pain right now." Sly Fox's own pudgy face was also covered in grief. "He viewed you as a friend, which is why we're gonna let you send him on the final leg of his journey." "Send him on his final journey." Cloudhawk dumbly accepted the dagger, then turned to look at the horrifically wounded Woola. Woola stared at Cloudhawk with his one good eye, a look of grief and agony in his gaze. "Woola wants to keep living, but he can't live much longer. There's no place in the wastelands that can treat injuries like this, and even if he did by some miracle manage to survive, the only thing waiting for him would be a life as a cripple. You know exactly what that sort of life would be." A heavy look on his face, Sly Fox explained to Cloudhawk, "As a man, you gotta make sure you live up to the trust your battle brothers place in you. This is Woola's final wish, and a chance for us to relieve him of his pain." Woola was beyond rescue. Cloudhawk knew this, he just couldn't accept it. The powerful vital energy which made this mutant so strong was now a curse that was trapping him in a cage of agony, preventing him from dying. The one and only thing they could do for him was to relieve him of his pain. "But Woola saved my life. How can I kill him?" Sly Fox said heavily, "You grew up in the wastelands. By now, you should have learned to look death straight in the face. This is something every wastelander has to learn and experience. It is a crazy world we live in. Staying alive ain't always a good thing, and dying can be a form of release. Daya, understand what I'm saying? Don't waste any more time. Woola's in a lot of pain right now." Cloudhawk was silent for a few seconds as he waged a mental war against himself, then slowly lifted the dagger up. He murmured softly, "Farewell, Woola. Make sure you aren't reborn into the wastelands in your next life." As the dagger descended, Woola opened his remaining eye one final time. The only look in his eyes was that of gratitude. Book 1, Chapter 42, A Man's Choice. You are listening at novelfull.audio. By now, Mad Dog had already hacked countless giant rats to pieces at the entrance of the cave. He was so soaked in gore that he looked as though he had been dragged out of a lake of blood, with bits and pieces of flesh plastering his entire body. It was impossible to tell how much of it was his and how much of it belonged to the giant rats. These terrifying mutabeasts were individually much weaker than the rot wolves, but they were actually even more savage and suicidally bloodthirsty. Sly Fox patted Cloudhawk on the shoulders, then called out to the nearby mercenaries, "Help out." No matter how powerful he was, Mad Dog was close to spent. The giant rat blood was both poisonous and bacteria-laden, and Mad Dog's entire body was covered with both wounds and rat blood. He was already in very bad shape. Once he fell, the rest of the mercenaries would be in trouble. Cloudhawk picked up his shotgun, then followed the other mercenaries as they charged towards the cave entrance. He seemed to let his fury explode alongside the shells of the shotgun, firing blasts that instantly knocked down multiple attacking giant rats. Suddenly, there was a shift within the ranks of the rat swarm. Multiple green-furred acid rats and red-furred blast rats began to stealthily advance. Once these dangerous and highly mutated rats reached the entrance of the cave, they would inflict grievous injuries upon the mercenaries. These creatures were the bane of all close-combat fighters. No matter what, they couldn't let them get closer to Mad Dog. Sly Fox didn't waste a single bullet. Each shot came out with perfect accuracy and struck one of the special mutant rats dead center, ensuring that they were disposed of safely and outside the critical zone. The battle around the entrance grew increasingly frenzied, with blood and gore splashing everywhere. Rat corpses were piling up into miniature hills, and there was a literal river of foul blood flowing out. They had to have killed at least 60 or 70 of those giant rats. This was an absolute slaughterhouse, an unprecedentedly calamitous wastelands battle. Diovico the mercenaries had suffered extremely heavy casualties, and their total combat power was slowly falling. Sly Fox didn't have many bullets left either. The worst part was, more and more giant rats continued to replenish the ranks of the fallen. From start to finish, their numbers had not diminished in the slightest. The swarm of giant rats was like an endless sea of chattering darkness. The mercenaries did their best to fend them off and stay alive, but were like a tiny boat that was constantly at risk of being capsized by the stormy waves of the sea. Sly Fox's twin customized pistols continued to spit furious death, but this was of almost no deterrence to the fearless dire rats, and the vermin continued to swarm forwards. By now, Sly Fox only had a single ammo clip left, while Mad Dog had suffered more than 15 wounds. Even though he was an incredibly powerful metahuman, he was at the brink of collapse. As for Cloud Hawk, he had long ago thrown away his shotgun. He held his tri-bladed staff in a double-handed grip and used it to continue the fight. By now, 80 or 90 dire rats had perished. The mercenary ranks were beginning to shrink as their casualties mounted as well. Ah! A bloody hole was torn into one of the vanguard mercenaries by the fangs of a giant rat. Sly Fox hurriedly shot dead the offending rat, but even more giant rats swarmed the injured mercenary before the others had a chance to pull him out. He collapsed as his legs were torn to pieces, leaving behind virtually nothing besides his leg bones. The mercenary did his best to clamber into the cave on his hands, but the giant rats dragged him backwards, his fingers leaving bloody marks on the cave floor. In the end, he disappeared into that endless sea of darkness. Damn it! The enraged mercenaries redoubled their efforts against the rats. The battle had already devolved into a war of attrition, a bloody fight where either side would win only a Pyrrhic victory at best. It was clear, however, that the rats were present in such great numbers that they would be able to crush the mercenaries in the end. If this continued, it would only be a matter of time before the humans faced their doom. However, right at this moment, something completely unexpected happened. A shrill squeak rang out from within the rat swarm. The squeak was loud and incredibly sharp, boring straight into the ears of every single person, carrying with it an aura of majesty and dignity. It was as though the swarm had received orders from its king, as all of the rats instantly halted their attacks and retreated a few dozen paces. The rat swarm suddenly parted, and a giant rat that looked very different from the rest emerged from within. Its fur was completely white and slick, almost silken. It was able to both crawl around on all fours as well as walk upright on its hind legs. It was triple the size of an ordinary giant rat, almost on par with an ordinary human. A certain distance separated the two sides. The giant silver rat stood up straight on its high legs, then swept the humans with its beady black gaze. Every single human present could sense what that gaze held. Intelligence, cruelty, remorselessness, and cold hate. Animals shouldn't have gazes like that, and they shouldn't look like that either. Judging from its head, its eyes, its nose, its ears, its mouth, and its knife-sharp claws, it looked just like an ordinary rat, but its gaze, demeanor, and posture marked it as human. The Rat King. This had to be the Rat King. Even the most fearless of mercenaries who had often ventured into the wastelands, when faced with this strange creature, felt a sense of terror slowly seep deep into their very bones. The Rat King stared at the stunned, exhausted, and heavily wounded mercenaries, then its sharp mouth slowly hooked upwards, almost in a mocking smile. Was it a smile? Perhaps it was. Perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps the Rat King didn't really know what this expression signified, and perhaps it was just an automatic reflex on its part, but the effect was striking and bizarre. None of the humans present would ever be able to forget this sight. They felt stunned, shocked, horrified, and most of all, they felt disbelief. By now Cloudhawk had seen many terrifying sights, but none of them could hold a candle to what he saw in front of him right now. Finally, the mercenaries understood why they were in such terrible shape. This mutant Rat King their employer was interested in, it clearly was an intelligent ratling. Although they had already thought of this possibility once they had been trapped and ambushed, for it to actually become real before their very eyes was something else entirely. Both rookies like Cloudhawk and experienced figures like Mad Dog and Sly Fox all stared in disbelief at the Rat King. Hell, who would accept this? This world really had gone mad. Otherwise, how could even rats have evolved to gain human-like intelligence? Sly Fox was filled with bitter regret. If he had known what a freak this Rat King was, he never would have dared to accept this mission no matter how bold or greedy he was. This completely overturned his worldview and surpassed his imagination. The Rat King had been commanding its army to attack, but had suffered extremely heavy casualties due to these humans being much stronger than expected. Although the rats had more than enough numbers to drown these humans under their weight, they would probably be forced to pay a calamitous price in doing so. As a result, the Rat King wanted to use a different method to deal with these humans. The Rat King stared at the mercenaries in that callous, weighing manner, almost as though it was looking at a flopping fish on the chopping block. The mercenaries couldn't help but feel a sense of fear and dread. Crack! Suddenly, without any warning, Sly Fox fired his pistol. The dire rats were under the control of the Rat King. So long as he was able to kill the Rat King, the dire rats would have lost their commander and would fall into a state of chaos. At that time, the mercenaries would have a chance to escape. This was what Sly Fox was thinking, but as soon as he fired his pistol, the Rat King dodged aside with shadowy grace. A different dire rat perished instead, its head exploding into tiny pieces. The other dire rats seemed to be enraged by this and immediately began to grow restless, as though they were about to once more initiate their swarming attacks. The Rat King, however, charged forwards and tore apart two of the more disobedient rats while continuously squeaking warnings at the others. Only then did the restless swarm once more grow calm. The Rat King's shrill squeaks seemed to carry more than 10 different types of sounds and tones. This virtually fulfilled all the prerequisites necessary for something to be classified as a language. Speaking and writing, these were the seeds of any civilization. In other words, if given enough time and numbers, these creatures might propagate into a new and intelligent race. The very thought of such a thing brought shivers down the spines of the men present. The Rat King was extremely cautious. It had spent a very long period of time inspecting the mercenaries, and by now knew just how powerful each mercenary was. There was no way Sly Fox would be able to hit it, and if even Sly Fox was unable to hit it, the other mercenaries could forget about even trying. Cloudhawk stared at the endless masses of dire rats, his heart filled with utter despair. They had no chance at all. Mad Dog was heavily wounded and exhausted, while Sly Fox was almost out of bullets. Under the guidance of the Rat King, the rat swarm could simply choose to keep them surrounded and starve them out. After 2 or 3 days without access to food or water, the mercenaries would collapse without the rats needing to lift a claw. The Rat King suddenly ordered the giant rats to split apart. The hundreds of dire rats continued to keep the cave entrance surrounded, but they left a wide empty space at the very center. The mercenaries looked at each other. What was this all about? Was the rat trying to lure them out and then surround them? They weren't fools. But right at this moment, the Rat King suddenly crouched downwards and scuttled forwards, all four limbs on the ground. It looked almost like a cat as it stared warily at the humans. Sly Fox wanted to fire upon it on multiple occasions, but every time his fingers so much as twitched the Rat King would move slightly in response. He simply didn't feel any confidence in being able to hit the Rat King. The freak has come out on its own. Cloudhawk immediately said, "This is a good opportunity. Let's charge out and kill it." "Yeah, not gonna be that easy to kill the Rat King, kid." Everyone knew that it was obviously a trap. Sly Fox shook his head. "Don't be rash. Let's see what it wants to do." After moving closer to the humans, the Rat King suddenly stood up on its two hind legs, and then it did something which completely flummoxed all of the humans. It raised an arm, extended a finger, and then pointed it at one of the mercenaries. The Rat King let out a few ear-piercing screeches that were filled with mockery and disdain. Was it challenging the mercenaries to one-on-one duels? The mercenary the Rat King was pointing at was Cook. Cook was still in fairly decent shape right now. He wasn't nearly as injured or as exhausted as Mad Dog. He was also incredibly burly and muscular, and so he was quite prominent amongst the mercenary ranks. Fucking rat. After being dazed for a brief moment, Cook began to curse as though he had just suffered the greatest of insults. Fuck. You won a solo. Let's solo, you little fucker. Do you think I'm actually scared of you? Don't take the risk. Sly Fox immediately moved to stop Cook. We ain't got any idea as to how tough it is. Cook gave Sly Fox a hard look, the meaning in his eyes clear. Boss, this is our only shot. Sly Fox still refused to agree. Too risky. Cook argued, we only have a chance to kill it if we fight it in close combat. All of the rats here are under its command. If we can kill it, we'll have a shot at survival. His words made sense. The mercenaries had no chance at breaking out by force. Their only shot was to kill this Rat King, but this duel entailed an enormous amount of risk. Was Cook really a match for the Rat King? Mad Dog was sitting off to one side, panting raggedly. Even if you kill it, you won't be coming back either. You know that, right? They were completely surrounded by giant rats, and the duel would take place within their ranks. Even if Cook really did kill the Rat King, the other giant rats would immediately descend into a state of chaos and swarm him. There would be virtually no chance for him to escape. Ha! No shit. Cook let out a fearless laugh, a relaxed, sincere look in his eyes. There was no hesitation or fear in his gaze at all. Sly Fox. Mad Dog. If the two of you hadn't rescued me from those slave traders all those years ago, I probably would have ended up dead and buried under some rock in the wastelands by now. Thanks for taking such good care of me for so long. We're all men, so I'm not gonna get all emo on you with some fancy arst speech. Hell, I'd blush if I did. Just let me go and don't try to stop me. The mercenaries all fell silent, while Mad Dog and Sly Fox exchanged a glance. Finally, Sly Fox let out a long sigh. It's not your job to die for us. You can't go. Cloudhawk shot to his feet in opposition. Chances are that none of us are going to survive. Let's just fight together and die together. Listen up, newbie. We haven't known each other for all that long, but I can tell that you're a pretty decent kid. Problem is, you're still too young, but I'm sure that if you survive this rite of passage, you'll eventually grow up to become a real man. Cook's enormous, tall, and muscular figure made the skinny Cloudhawk look even smaller in comparison. He clapped Cloudhawk on the shoulders, then let out a loud laugh. The burly wastelander picked up a pair of axes, his armor so caked in blood that it looked as though it had been dyed a new color. He strode forwards firmly and without hesitation. He didn't look like he was walking forwards to his death, he looked as though he was walking out onto the most important stage of his life. When that happens, you'll understand the choice I'm making today. Book 1, Chapter 43 Rage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Right now, the mercenaries had almost no chance of surviving this. The sole, slim chance they had lay in killing the Rat King, but Cook faced suicidal levels of danger in choosing to confront it. Even if he really did kill the Rat King, the rat swarm would launch an immediate attack. They wouldn't have any chance to save him. But, there were no other choices to be made. This was the only shot they had. Cook strode forwards, an axe in each hand. These battle axes were custom-made mercenary weapons. Each axe was roughly 2 feet long and extremely heavy. Each axe blade was shaped like a half-moon, and both axes were stained with black blood that continued to slowly drip down towards the ground. Just as Cook reached the center, the Rat King issued an order to the dire rats, having them surround Cook while giving him enough free space. In this way, they would be able to prevent the other mercenaries from launching sneak attacks or ambushes mid-battle. The damn creature did at least honor its word. It had offered a duel, and a duel this would be. It didn't simply wish to trick the mercenaries into coming out, then murdering them. What was truly amazing, however, was the fact that the dire rats were nothing more than ordinary mutated rats. Somehow, the Rat King had managed to train these dumb creatures into an army that it could command at will. This was no easy or ordinary feat. The Rat King landed on the ground on all fours, adopting a vigilant battle posture. Its sleek, silver-white fur served as a form of natural leather armor. Its 4 paws were unable to hold weapons or manipulate firearms, but the 4 claws on each paw served as exceptional weapons. It rubbed 8 of those claws together as it let out an ear-piercing screech. Cook stared at the Rat King. The Rat King stared right back at Cook. The Rat King's black eyes were unfathomably deep, but a look of hatred could be seen to slowly appear within it. The Rat King had been born in a wasteland's laboratory. That bloody, cruel place had been filled with hundreds of mutabeasts, and the Rat King had been the cleverest specimen there. Thus, at a very young age it had learned quite a few things from the humans who had operated that laboratory. Although it was unable to actually produce human sounds, it was able to partially understand human speech. It understood humans, and it hated humans. Every single human was worthy of death. Waves of a murderous aura began to spread out from the Rat King. Cook was the first to move. He instantly let out a lion-like roar, causing the surrounding dire rats to twitch in surprise, then shot out with incomprehensible speed like a battering ram towards the Rat King. His aura and his power was such that a person standing in front of him would feel as though a mountain was smashing towards him. He was one of the oldest members of the Tartarus mercenaries. There was a significant difference in power between Cook and the company captains, but he was definitely an elite amongst elites when compared to the ordinary mercenaries. He was a classic example of a strength metahuman, but the tremendous amount of power his muscles could release allowed him to move and fight in close combat with nearly as much speed as an agility metahuman. His 2 axes were filled with explosive power as they furiously chopped out in 2 beautiful arcs towards the Rat King. If this blow landed against the Rat King, it wouldn't matter how tough the Rat King's fur was, not even iron armor could withstand such a strike. The Rat King would definitely be cleaved in twain. Unfortunately, he was too slow. The Rat King's hind legs flexed, sending it dodging 3 feet back and perfectly avoiding the axe chops. Cook, however, seemed to have anticipated this. Just as the axe in his left hand descended and missed the Rat King, he suddenly leapt 3 meters into the air off his right leg, then hacked down with his other axe with the speed of a thunderbolt. The first chop was vertical while the second was horizontal. The 2 strikes were perfectly linked together and part of one smooth motion. In both speed and power, this double strike was simply supreme. Boom! The ground itself seemed to shake. The thick and heavy axes carved out deep gouges into the earth, while the Rat King retreated by another few feet. It was simply far too fast, and Cook's furious strikes all completely missed it. Before the Rat King had a chance to find its footing, Cook once more hurtled towards him while kicking up a storm of sand. Cook's twin axes danced in the air like a pair of vipers, spinning like a pair of deadly windmills as he repeatedly struck out against the Rat King. Ever since Cook had entered this arena, he had discarded all hope of surviving. He was determined to die, and so he completely focused on attacking while holding nothing back. This sort of suicidal, kamikaze attack would cause even fighters who were significantly stronger than him to be discomfited. Duels between experts could be decided in a single instant. If one side was nervous and afraid of dying while the other had already accepted death, there would obviously be a significant difference in morale which would have an impact on how well each performed. The Rat King's pitch-black eyes suddenly gleamed with savage light as it came to a sudden halt, lifting up its paws to block. Clang! Clang! The windmill attacks suddenly came to an end as the two axes came crashing down against the 8 sharp claws of the Rat King. The terrifying power of the blows kicked up a cloud of dust. The man and the rat stood there, the Rat King having elected to use this type of strike to defend against the enemy's attacks. Both sides began to exert as much strength as they could, and for a time they were evenly matched. The mercenaries were all shocked to see this. They could tell from this brief moment of combat that the Rat King was vastly faster than Cook, and a close match for him in raw strength as well. The difference in ability between the two was quite apparent. The Rat King wasn't just the political leader of these giant rats, it was also the most powerful member of the race. Cook roared angrily as he once again chopped out with his axe against the Rat King's head, but he hit nothing but shadows. The Rat King, after dodging his attack, struck out with a set of claws and tore a bone-deep wound into Cook's chest. Cook endured the pain, turning to deliver a counter-attack when the Rat King once more shot straight past him. The creature was simply too fast. Cook fell down to one knee, an enormous wound having been torn into his upper thighs. He continued to howl angrily as he brandished his hatchet, while the Rat King landed on the ground and then immediately leaping towards Cook once more. This time, Cook let out a blood-curdling scream. 3 of his fingers had been cut off, and they went flying away along with the axe they had been gripping. The axe flew more than 10 meters away before it crashed to the ground. Not good. Cloudhawk's heart clenched. Cook continued to press the attack with his right hand, while the Rat King didn't let up in the slightest. With the next strike, it tore open Cook's chest. Cook no longer had the strength to lift up the axe, and it slipped out of his grasp and thudded down to the ground. He had lost. He had completely lost. He had never imagined that the difference in power between them would be as great as this. The Rat King still didn't pause in the slightest, continuously dashing past him and raking bloody wounds in Cook with its claws each time. In just 10 or so seconds, Cook's entire body was covered with bloody wounds. The Rat King did not, however, aim any attacks at Cook's vital points. It wasn't intending to kill Cook. It was torturing him instead, causing Cook to let out one agonized and enraged howl after another. This sight thoroughly enraged all of the mercenaries, and their eyes spat hatred towards the Rat King. In a duel, it was normal for the victor to live and the loser to die, this was true in both the wastelands and in the outposts. But, the Rat King's true purpose clearly wasn't to challenge the humans. The real reason it had chosen to fight a duel against a human was to instigate and enrage the other humans and thus cause them to voluntarily charge out of the cave and be entrapped by the endless waves of rats. C. Damn this creature. It actually understood psychology and manipulation. Grah! Damn you! Cook was covered in dozens of giant, bloody wounds. His body had been converted into a mishmash of blood and gore, almost as though a butcher had gone to work on him with a cleaver. He could also tell what the Rat King's intentions were, and he howled in rage and grief, "Go ahead and kill me, you sackless Sonyafovich. Kill me if you have any balls. How could Cloudhawk accept this? How could he possibly withstand this type of torment? How could he ever be able to endure this type of humiliation? A wild animal was tormenting and torturing one of his brothers, right in front of him. Was he supposed to just sit there and watch without actually doing anything, to just stick his head in the sand and pretend that nothing was wrong? And in truth, Cloudhawk wasn't the only one enraged. Mad Dog had an even worse temper, and it exploded when Mad Dog saw what was going on. Attack them. Wipe these motherfuckers out. Boss. Boss. Don't go. 5 mercenaries had to work together to hold Mad Dog back. Tears shone in their eyes as they called out, "It's a trick. Don't fall for the bastard's trick." Mad Dog bellowed, "I don't give a flying fuck if it's a trick or not. Let go of me." Cloudhawk shared the same rage and grief the other mercenaries felt. This was a grim, callous, and preposterous era they were living in. In times like this, trust and faith were more valuable than anything else. To the mercenaries, the Tartarus Company was their home, and every single brother was a treasured family member. A rat actually dared to torture one of their family members to death. Nobody would be able to endure such a sight, but right now, Cook was in more agony than anyone else. "Don't come out. Don't come out." Cook had been tormented to the point where he looked inhuman. He knelt there on the ground, looking like a butchered corpse, and blood mixed with tears on his face as he called out with agony, "Let me die. Let me die. Let me die." Cook wasn't just suffering mere physical agony, the humiliation and mental agony he was suffering was far greater than the fleshly pain. He wasn't afraid of death. If he was afraid of death, he never would have walked out to accept the duel. But he never imagined that his resolve would be used as a tool to manipulate his brothers. At a time like this, to a valiant, tough-as-nails man like him, death was a form of release. He was a proud, intrepid wastelands warrior, but at the end of his life, he was now kneeling on the ground, screaming for death. His overconfidence, his resolve, his wish to protect his fellows, they had all transformed into endless torment and humiliation. Crack. The utterly heartbroken Slyfox fired a shot, but the Rat King seemed to have seen this coming. It immediately dragged Cook into the rat swarm, and the countless rats immediately covered Cook, making it impossible for the mercenaries to see him. The only thing left was Cook's unending, miserable screams. The screams were filled with resentment, shame, rage, and grief. Every single scream stabbed into Cloudhawk's heart like a dagger. Cloudhawk's hands slowly curled into fists as he stared at the brutal scene before him. He could no longer hold back the furious rage that was building inside his breast. As the mercenaries were all focused on holding Mad Dog back, Cloudhawk immediately rose up and charged outside. "Hey! What are you doing?" Slyfox was stunned. "Stop him, quick!" Cloudhawk had never been as furious as he was right now. He leapt forward with the speed and grace of a panther, giving the 2 nearby mercenaries no chance to catch up at all as he charged out of the cave. As soon as he did so, the rat swarm surged forwards to welcome him. "Fuck off!" Cloudhawk let out an enraged bellow. The murderous aura emanating from him caused even the dire rats to pause momentarily. In this moment, they felt as though it wasn't a human in front of them, rather, it was an utterly enraged wastelands beast. "I'll fight you. I want to fight you." Cloudhawk lifted his tri-bladed staff up high, then pointed it directly at the Rat King. "I know you can understand me. Come and fight me, if you dare." Rage, grief, shame, hate. Although the Rat King didn't have the vocabulary necessary to express these things, he could keenly sense the presence of these emotions. It had spent more than 10 years being tormented and experimented on by humans, and it had seen its parents and siblings die in front of it. It understood these feelings quite well. It let out a shrill screech, and the rat swarm slowly began to retreat. In truth, it could tell at a glance how strong or how weak the humans were. It could tell that Mad Dog was just as strong as it. Even though Mad Dog had already suffered heavy injuries, the cautious Rat King wouldn't dare to challenge him to a battle. Cloud Hawk, however, was clearly an underage and undersized youth. There was no need for the Rat King to worry about him. Cloud Hawk held his black tri-bladed staff up high as he charged forwards, moving faster and faster as he sprinted towards the Rat King so quickly he looked as though he was flying. Right now, Cloud Hawk only had a single thought in his mind. Kill it. Kill it. Kill it. Whether for Woola's sake or for Cook's sake, or for the sake of the others. Cloud Hawk had to kill it. Book 1, Chapter 44 Betrayed. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Cloud Hawk was a rookie who was taking part in a mission for the very first time. He was completely inexperienced, and he had never before battled against dangerous creatures like these. In front of him was a freak which even the experienced mercenaries had never seen before, and which was far crueler and more sadistic than any ordinary beasts. Not only was Cloud Hawk not terrified, he actually went out to challenge the thing. The kid has gone absolutely stark raving mad. True, during the past 2 days Cloud Hawk's performance in battle was far superior to what the mercenaries had predicted, but he still ranked at the very bottom in terms of ability. If even Cook had been completely unable to fight back against this freak, how did the kid think he would stand a chance at all? This sort of behavior was absolutely suicidal. Sly Fox, what the fuck are you afraid of? Mad Dog actually knocked down 2 of the people in front of him. Even the newest rookie has more balls than you spineless pussy. If we die, we die. Mad Dog ain't no bitch. Sly Fox stared at Cloud Hawk as the kid charged out, then let out a long sigh. Fine, then. Let's charge together. We were waiting for you to say that. Rookies. Follow my lead. The other mercenaries had been burning with the desire to do just that. Men, by their very nature, are filled with stubbornness and defiance. They weren't going to be able to escape today, so if they had to die, they were going to die with a bang. To die while hiding in a mountain cave like turtles hiding in their shells was far too fucking pathetic. As soon as the mercenaries began to move, the rats began to move in unison as well. The 2 sides instantly became locked in yet another bloody battle. Cloud Hawk focused all of his attention towards the opponent in front of him. When the Rat King noticed how the mercenaries were attempting to surround it, it felt as though there was no need to waste time. It would first kill this small human, then wipe out the others. It leapt off the ground with its 4 paws, sending it straight forwards in a straight line charge. Even though Cloud Hawk's reactive instincts were better than Cook's, the Rat King was simply far too fast. There was no way Cloud Hawk could dodge, and so he didn't. Instead, he barreled straight towards the Rat King. When the Rat King was 10 meters away from him, Cloud Hawk's black tri-bladed staff began to vibrate slightly. When the Rat King was 5 meters away, it once more leapt off the ground towards Cloud Hawk. It launched 8 incredibly sharp claw strikes straight at the puny human's critical organs. Its claws were like 8 lethally sharp knives stabbing straight at Cloud Hawk. Here it comes, here it comes. Victory or defeat would be determined by this strike. Ignoring everything else, Cloud Hawk struck out with his exorcist staff. The tri-blades had already begun to spin frantically, reaching an incredible rotational velocity in an extremely short period of time. Cloud Hawk had poured all of his energy and his very being into this strike. Sparks appeared from the dancing exorcist staff as it exploded with tempestuous might, generating streams of energy which caused the dirt and pebbles in the surrounding area to fly into the air. Go die. Cloud Hawk bellowed, pouring all of his rage and hatred into this strike. The Rat King's 8 claws, impervious to normal weapons, were instantly shattered by the terrifying destructive force of Cloud Hawk's strike. The shockwave generated by the clash was simply incredible, with the exorcist staff releasing its full, pent-up, tornado-like power onto the body of the Rat King. The Rat King let out a miserable squeak as it was sent flying 10 meters away. Its body actually fell apart into two pieces in midair. Blood splattered the ground as its two halves finally fell down. The rats were all stunned. Even the mercenaries stared, stupefied. The weakest-looking human had actually just unleashed a strike of incredible power. There was no way an ordinary person could possibly possess such strength. This power, this savagery, it defied all science and all common sense. The Rat King didn't instantly die. The upper half of its body was struggling in agony, seeming to want to reconnect with the other half. It wanted to stay alive. It didn't want to die. But its body had been completely torn apart, and its innards had been completely splattered. Even though the Rat King didn't know exactly what was going on, it knew that it wasn't going to survive this. The Rat King turned its increasingly blurry gaze towards the youth. The youth had unleashed all of his rage and hatred in that strike. Now, he simply stood there while panting and gulping. So the brat succeeded. He gained revenge for his friend. But what about me? What about my vengeance? I haven't even found that damn madman. I haven't torn him apart, haven't ripped him from limb to limb. These humans, they might view me as being evil, but in my eyes these arrogant and ignorant humans are the true definition of evil. Why did you capture us? Torture us? Why did you barge into my territory? Why did you kill my children? You even skinned our dead and ate our flesh. You tore our bones out of our bodies. Why? 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 The dying thought of this intelligent animal was that it suddenly envied its fellows. It truly wished that it was like them, incapable of rational thought or planning. If they were hungry, they ate. They survived on instinct alone. The Rat King didn't want to die. It really didn't want to die. The Rat King let out one final terrified, agonized squeak, then everything went dark. Now that the Rat King had been slain, the dire rats instantly lost their cohesiveness. No longer under any control, the hundreds of dire rats entered a state of chaos. Some turned to flee, some ran back and forth, and a few continued to press the attack against the mercenaries. Cloudhawk felt completely exhausted after having used his tri-blade staff to slay the Rat King. His head was woozy and his ears were deafened. He was barely even able to stay standing, and this was the moment that 7 or 8 dire rats surrounded and attacked him. Cloudhawk was completely out of energy. He was able to feebly swing his staff a few times before the dire rats knocked him down with ease. Right at this moment, a machete flew past him and plunged deep into the body of a dire rat. Mad Dog's muscular body was covered in blood. He had charged next to Cloudhawk, and with but a single chop he knocked that dire rat flying. He then pulled his machete back and growled, "Got any fight left?" Cloudhawk struggled to nod. "Good. We're gonna carve a path out of here." With the Rat King's death, the rat swarms had lost their cohesiveness. The majority of the dire rats began to leave in various directions. Although a few hundred continued to surround and assault the mercenaries, they were now under much less pressure than during the previous battle. Despite that, it was still a brutal fight. The mercenaries were completely spent, and all of them were covered in wounds. They had to battle for over 10 more minutes before the dire rats finally and fully retreated. 6 more mercenaries had died during that last battle, leaving just 12 of them alive. This mission had caused the Tartarus mercenaries to suffer catastrophic losses. They had lost half of their combat power, but thankfully, the other half had made it out alive. Otherwise, the Tartarus mercenaries would have been a mercenary company in the hells of Tartarus. Mad Dog turned to stare at Cloudhawk as if the latter was a freak. "How the hell did you do that earlier?" Cloudhawk knew that there was no way he would be able to hide this any longer. He briefly told the mercenaries part of the story regarding the blood-soaked queen and the exorcist's staff. All of the mercenaries were stunned by what they heard. None of them had imagined that Cloudhawk was someone who was capable of supernatural abilities like the blood-soaked queen. "I knew letting you join us was the right choice. Sly Fox felt both envy and jealousy. The kid could very well end up becoming stronger than both him and Mad Dog. The company's taken a heavy hit. It's gonna be real hard for us to recover from this, but if you can reach the blood-soaked Queen's level of power, we can just go and conquer a different Wastelands outpost. In the future, we're gonna be the bosses. Fuck begging for scraps. Conquer an outpost. Cloudhawk had never even considered this as an option. His dream had always been to leave the Wastelands. As for becoming as powerful as the blood-soaked Queen, Cloudhawk didn't think that was very likely. Exorcist staffs were the lowest level relics a demon hunter could use, while the blood-soaked Queen was most likely a high level demon hunter. Cook was dead. Woola was dead. They had lost far too many people. There was no need to bury the corpses of the dead, because no matter how deep they buried them, the corpses would still be unearthed by wild animals. This was simply how things were in the Wastelands. They were Wastelanders. They lived in the Wastelands and died in the Wastelands, and when they died they would naturally return to the Wastelands in this fashion. The survivors briefly mourned for the dead. Then, they departed. The 12 surviving mercenaries had all suffered heavy wounds, and the injuries were beginning to take a toll. Even worse, many of the wounds would probably become infected. It could be said that the situation was quite dire. There was no way they could stay here, they had to leave as soon as possible. Sly Fox and Mad Dog led the mercenaries out of the gorge, and when they walked out, their gazes froze. A tattered, Wastelands-style airship was hovering in the air above the ruins up ahead. No one knew when the airship had arrived, but every single mercenary recognized it, and Cloudhawk had seen it once as well. This airship belonged to the rich employer who had employed them multiple times in the past. These were the ones who had issued the mission to kill the Rat King. A look of fury flashed past Mad Dog's face. These sons of bitches. They completely fucked us. I should tear a few of their fucking heads off. Don't move. A strange look was on Sly Fox's face. He thought quickly, then said, "Don't let them notice us. We need to leave immediately." "Leave?" One of the mercenaries shouted angrily, "We got killed out there on this mission. We gonna walk away without even taking our pay?" Sly Fox whispered in response, "That's the problem. The intelligence report was completely off. I've looked at it from every perspective, and the only answer is that they were trying to get us killed." Mad Dog was shocked and enraged. "Are you saying they sold us out?" "Yeah. They sold us out." Sly Fox was clearly beginning to panic. "We need to go right now. Otherwise, we ain't gonna make it." The mercenaries slowly began to realize the gravity of their situation. When they had first received the mission, they had all been puzzled by many of its irregularities. Right at this moment, they heard a low, bestial growl ring out. "It seems you aren't as stupid as I thought you were." Cloudhawk was badly startled, and the other mercenaries all turned pale as well. A dark human silhouette stepped out onto the sands. This was a tall, muscular man who was dressed in black leathers. Not an inch of his skin was exposed to the elements. He wore a black breathing apparatus that looked like a long-billed bird's face, and the apparatus was connected to all sorts of wires and tubes. Rough, ragged breathing could be heard from behind the mask, and a few streaks of white mist belched out of the mouth opening. It made him look like a freak who had the face of a bird. It was him. This outfit was too distinctive. Nobody who saw this man would ever be able to forget him. The mercenaries couldn't help but take a few steps back. A grim look was on Sly Fox's face as he asked, "Why?" The man dressed in black leathers cast a cold glance at them, his features hidden by that bird-beaked breathing apparatus. "I liked working with you as well, actually. You are pretty strong for Wastelanders, which makes it all the more unfortunate that my master intends to annihilate Black Flag Outpost. You serve as an obstacle, and so I'll have to trouble you to die for me." Black Flag Outpost. He belonged to the same organization as the leader of the sweepers who had just attacked the outpost. In other words, he was a servant of the demon. His target was the demon hunter, the blood-soaked queen. Book 1, Chapter 45 Wipeout. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The Rat King, despite its power, hadn't been able to wipe the mercenaries out. This was outside of the black-garbed man's expectations. The mercenaries truly were more powerful than he had expected. Still, it didn't matter. Things were still manageable. How much of a threat could these battered, injured, and broken-down mercenaries pose? The mission had been a scheme from the very start. It was a scheme aimed against the Black Flag outpost and against the blood-soaked queen. They had already begun to prepare for a full assault against the outpost. The elite guards of Black Flag outpost had already suffered heavy losses. The Tartarus mercenaries had been backstabbed and half destroyed. The blood-soaked queen's injuries had yet to be healed. The situation was far grimmer than anyone in the outpost knew. Black Flag outpost was facing the end days. Right at this moment, a few dozen figures appeared in the area around them. These warriors were all dressed in classic Wastelander outfits. They wore rough helmets made from a mishmash of leather and metal, and their faces were half covered by protective visors which helped block out the sand. They were primarily armed with firearms and longbows. This was a superbly outfitted Wastelander squad, and they had all come from the airship. That meant they were the Man in Black's subordinates. The Man in Black said in a very sincere and gentle manner, "How would you prefer to die? Cut the bullshit." Sly Fox lifted his pistol up and fired off a shot at the Man in Black. The powerful recoil from the shot caused Sly Fox to stagger a few steps back, but a thumb-sized hole appeared in the man's chest. "You can die first." The shot had hit. Was the man dead? The mercenaries could hardly believe it. The shot had been at point-blank range, and Sly Fox had used one of his most powerful bullets. The shot had struck the man in his vitals and left a huge exit wound. By all rights, no human should be able to survive a shot like that. All of these factors combined should have meant that there would be no questions about the results, but they were in the wastelands. In the damnable wastelands, nothing was impossible. Nothing was absolute. Common sense was often in short supply here, otherwise, how could a freak like the Rat King have arisen? The Man in Black didn't fall. He didn't scream. He didn't shake in pain. He didn't seem to even notice that he had been shot, and not a single drop of blood emerged from his wounds. He just stood there, continuing to stare at the mercenaries. A strange chill crawled up the spines of the mercenaries. It was like Sly Fox had shot an immobile block of wood that felt no pain at all. "Are you surprised?" That hoarse voice rang out from behind the man's strange breathing apparatus. He slowly pulled the black glove off his left hand, revealing something that did not look like a human hand at all. Several black tentacles squirmed out of his arm, flexing and tensing like whips. At the end of each tentacle was a sharp, knife-like bone. This was no normal human. This was a freak, a monster. Mad Dog drew his machete and charged straight forwards. "Let's see if you are still so cocky after I chop your ass into pieces." The Man in Black swept out with his left arm, the 5 tentacles coiling around each other as their bone-blades launched attacks from different directions. Mad Dog frantically had to hack right and left in order to defend. Slash. A wound appeared on Mad Dog's right shoulder. Slash. Another wound appeared on his upper thigh. Slash. Mad Dog was nearly disemboweled. Stop fighting and run like hell." Sly Fox bellowed as he hurriedly fired off 2 more shots at the Man in Black. One bullet struck the man in the chest, while the other hit the man in the head. The second shot shattered half of the man's mask, piercing through his skull and sending him staggering backwards. The Man in Black pressed a hand to his head, letting out a low growl. Clearly, this freak was only vulnerable in the head, but even a perfect head-shot hadn't been enough to immediately kill him. The Wastelander warriors were beginning to close in on them. If this fight continued, they would quickly end up surrounded. All of their foes were armed with long-distance weapons. If the mercenaries let themselves be surrounded and shot at from afar, there was no question that they would all die. Cloud Hawk and the mercenaries hurriedly ran over to support the badly injured Mad Dog, then frantically began to flee. By now, the man in black had managed to once more rise to his feet, a bullet in the palm of his hand. The wound in his head was slowly healing, and his flesh and blood were visibly regrowing across his face. No wonder this freak wasn't afraid of bullets. He was a terrifyingly strong recovery metahuman. You had to kill him instantly, otherwise, his wounds would recuperate within an extremely short period of time. The sweeper leader who had led the previous assault against Black Flag Outpost had been a control metahuman who was freakishly strong, but today, they encountered an even greater freak. How many subordinates like them did this demon have? Cloud Hawk had no idea. What about the blood-soaked queen? Would she be able to survive this fight? Still, this wasn't the time to be worrying about the blood-soaked queen. If the Tartarus mercenaries were fully staffed and in top physical condition, they might be able to give this freak a good fight. Now, however, they had no chance at all, and the man in black had a few dozen fully armed warriors coming to reinforce him. Cloud Hawk ran up ahead while helping to hold Mad Dog up. Sly Fox was in the middle, while 3 of the mercenaries served as the rear guard. The mercenaries frantically ran up a slope, unable to see what was on the other side. It seemed like there was an extremely sharp cliff up ahead, but there was nowhere for them to run. As the man in black chased after them, he suddenly slung out his right tentacle hand out towards them. It tore through the skies like a blurred shadow, reaching towards the mercenaries. The sharp attack came with incredible speed, forcing 2 of the mercenaries to come to a halt, pull out their weapons, then turn around and defend. However, they were each only able to block 2 or 3 attacks before the tentacles managed to pierce past their defenses, leaving giant gaping wounds in their neck as the bone blades severed their windpipes and arteries. The 2 mercenaries collapsed on the hilly terrain, unable to let out as much as a final scream. They pressed their hands to their necks, unable to staunch the spurting blood. After struggling for a few moments, they stopped moving. The man in black didn't move that quickly, but given the shape the mercenaries were in, it was going to be virtually impossible for them to shake him. That's a cliff up ahead. Mad Dog howled angrily, shaking off the supporting hands of Cloud Hawk and the other mercenary next to him. He was completely covered in wounds, and the one to his chest was especially deep. His innards were visible to the naked eye. Run! All of you, run! I'll stop them. Mad Dog knew that his wounds were too heavy. He chose to die in combat, fighting to his last breath. We'll help out. 3 of the surviving mercenaries came to a halt, looks of determination on their faces as they said to Sly Fox, boss, run. The man in black was simply too strong, and he had numerous reinforcements. It was impossible for all of them to escape. If they tried, they'd simply die one by one. What they had to do was sacrifice a few to buy the others some extra time. The strongest close combat mercenary was Mad Dog, but he was in such a sorry shape that there was no way he could stop the man in black all by himself. The 3 who had chosen to join him in his final stand were all some of the most talented mercenaries in the Tartarus Company. If they all worked together, they should be able to survive for a minute or 2. Everyone knew that there was no chance of victory here. In choosing to stay, they had chosen death. I fucked up everything else in my life, but the best decision I ever made was to become friends with you, fat ass. During the past 20 years, we built up this company and tore through the wastelands. We drank, we killed, we fucked women. I enjoyed the hell out of it all. Mad Dog stared at the wastelanders closing in on them, but a look of peace was on his ugly, savage, blood-soaked black face. Ignoring his wounds, he lifted up his machetes and charged towards the enemies. This life was worth it. I'll meet you in the next. Being part of the Tartarus company has been the greatest honor of our lives. The other 3 mercenaries followed right behind Mad Dog. Mad Dog. Let's die together and party together in the afterlife. They weren't as legendarily strong as Mad Dog, nor were they as skilled and talented as Sly Fox. However, they had loved being able to be led by a pair of such illustrious wastelanders. They had fought together, they had adventured together, and today, they would die together. What was there to regret? If they could choose to redo their lives, they would still choose to join. The enemy wastelanders began to fire upon them from afar. The man in black struck out with his 5-bladed tentacled fingers, attacking all 4 of them at once. However, this naturally reduced the pressure on each of them individually. Mad Dog was able to dodge several lethal strikes in a row. Screened by the others, he charged forwards and delivered a furious blow with his machete. Clang! The man in black used his right arm to block the strike. Mad Dog was more than twice as strong as Cook. The tremendous power behind his blow completely destroyed the enemy's right glove, but the right hand was different from the left hand. The right hand was humanoid in nature, but it was extremely thick and covered with what looked like an outer layer of bones. The bones were nearly as tough as steel, but when faced with Mad Dog's machete strike, the bones began to crack and shatter. This was a testament to how mighty Mad Dog was. The man in black was strong as well. After blocking Mad Dog's strike with his right arm, he seized the moment to deliver 3 consecutive strikes from his left arm with his tentacles. Mad Dog's chest, abdomen, and back were all stabbed. The mercenaries howled with rage, Mad Dog. Blood was pouring from Mad Dog's lips. He summoned one final burst of energy, delivering a machete blow to the man in black's head and plunging it halfway inside. Mad Dog was completely, thoroughly spent. If he was at his normal level of strength, he probably would have severed the man's head. No amount of regenerative power would have allowed the man in black to recover from that. But, in the wastelands, there were no ifs. Mad Dog had already done everything he could. For shots rang out from afar, and all 3 of the mercenaries were hit. By now, their bodies had been reduced to a parody of blood and gore, but they continued to fight with complete fearlessness, plunging their knives and swords into the body of the man in black. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The 4 mercenaries had battled to the very end, until the very moment that life left their bodies. When Cloud Hawk turned to look back, all he saw was Mad Dog's corpse be torn apart into multiple pieces by those bone blades. Blood and gore splattered the yellow earth, and the other 3 mercenaries had fallen into that pool of blood, never to rise again. Mad Dog, I'm coming too. Wait for me. Sly Fox knew what had happened. He knew that his friend of 20 years had just reached the end of the line. 20 years. 20 years of friendship. They had been together for so long, had faced the brutal wastelands together. In this age of darkness, truly trustworthy friends were as rare as unicorns, but their friendship had lasted for 20 years. No grief or pain was visible on Sly Fox's face. Grief and pain were emotions for weaker, lesser beings. The wastelands had no room for the weak. It was the destiny of every mercenary to die. Mad Dog had simply died a bit earlier than they had planned. What waited for them on the other side of this hill? Sand dunes. A cliff. Life. Death. The mercenaries would never have the chance to find out. The man in black and his wastelanders were in hot pursuit, and their bullets and arrows filled the air around the remaining mercenaries. The hill in front of them was 100 meters away, but there wasn't enough time. Time was a commodity, and they had used it all up. Sly Fox shouted at Cloud Hawk, "Kid, run like hell and don't turn back. Just jump down. But, escape. That's an order. And stay alive, that's another order." Sly Fox gradually began to slow down as he continued to shout at Cloud Hawk. You need to become stronger and tougher than anyone else. Find the fuckers behind this and then take revenge for us, got it? Go. Sly Fox came to a halt, as did the final surviving mercenaries. They had already decided to fight to the death. Cloudhawk's mind was completely blank as he continued his headlong rush. He heard the sound of gunfire from behind him, as well as the angry howls of the mercenaries as they charged into certain death. These sounds flayed his soul like knives, the most horrifying curses he had ever heard. Run. Live. Vengeance. Ignoring all else, Cloudhawk clambered up the hill, a sense of despair and wooziness in his mind. There really was a cliff at the end of the hill, and it was massive. It was like a gaping chasm that was hundreds of meters deep and at a perfect 90-degree angle. There was nothing which could slow his descent, and at the bottom was rubble. Had there been no hope at all from the very beginning? They had fought and struggled, but in the end, they had already reached the end of the line. Cloudhawk crouched by himself at the edge of the cliff, like a wounded animal that had been driven into a corner. He turned his head, only to see that all of the mercenaries had fallen. Sly Fox was slumped over a boulder. He had taken at least 10 shots, and his eyes were open and staring fixedly at Cloudhawk. No life was in those eyes. Cloudhawk never would have imagined that Sly Fox would have given the only chance at survival to him, a rookie who had joined them just 2 months ago. He never would have imagined that this fat and selfish man and his brutal mercenary comrades would sacrifice their own lives for the sake of giving him a chance. Cloudhawk rose to his feet, raising his head towards the skies and letting out a primal scream. Wind howled past him, kicking up a storm of yellow sand. He was a tiny speck in the wilderness, an inconsequential pinprick, and yet his voice traveled very, very far, and it was filled with stunning power. It was a primal cry of resistance, of stubbornness, of rage. He was cursing both the skies and the earth. Most of all, he cursed the wastelands. He was nothing more than an ant, but an ant who dared scream into the face of the uncaring heavens. He was small and weak, not worthy of concern or fear, but even at the very end he refused to bow his head in the face of destiny. Cloudhawk jumped into the air, and tumbled straight down the cliff. By the time the dozens of Wastelander warriors arrived at the edges of the cliff, they saw nothing more than a few mutated black crows. The youth had long ago disappeared. Had he fallen to his death? The cliff was hundreds of meters high, anybody who fell from such great heights would die. The only way Cloudhawk could have survived was if he grew wings like an actual hawk and soared into the skies. Otherwise, no amount of miracles could have kept him alive. Book 1, Chapter 46 Another World. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Cloudhawk plunged down the tall cliff, certain that he was going to die. There was no grasping at straws, no praying for some strange miracle. His body was completely relaxed, and his mind was completely free and at ease. He truly was like a hawk who was about to die, but was going to enjoy one final dive before doing so. This was a feeling of freedom, a moment in which his soul was completely empty and at peace. However, just as Cloudhawk was at peace, the stone in front of his chest suddenly began to activate, releasing incredible amounts of heat and a large amount of invisible yet powerful energy which swept across the area, causing space to twist and distort as though it was water that was being brought to a boil. It was happening. It was happening again. Cloudhawk seemed to have suddenly understood something, and he began to flail about madly like a drowning man who didn't know how to swim. The space around him began to completely twist into a whirlpool that looked much like the vortex which would form if someone stirred a pool of water. A heartbeat later, the entire world seemed to split apart. Cloudhawk suddenly felt as though he was seeing straight through to the very essence of all things. There was no light, no darkness, no matter, no energy. There were only those countless vibrating strings. Some were straight while others were looped, but all of them were vibrating and oscillating like the strings of a guitar, producing a strange melody as they did so. These things were the underpinnings of the very essence of all things. These countless vibrating strings came together to form matter. All types of matter were, on a fundamental level, the same. The only difference was the rate at which they vibrated, which caused them to manifest in different ways and which eventually produced the many different types of matter which made up this varied world. It all happened so incredibly quickly. Space rippled around Cloudhawk, and he then disappeared while falling from midair. By the time the world reassembled itself, Cloudhawk had come crashing down into a pile of rubble. The fall wasn't a light one, nor was it too heavy. All that could be said was that at least he didn't splatter apart upon contact with the ground. There was no way he had just fallen a few hundred meters. Still, Cloudhawk felt woozy and weak, almost as though his body was about to fall apart. He had to summon all of the remaining energy in his body just to crawl to his feet. Where was he? The skies were dark and gloomy, filled with rolling dark clouds. When the sunlight shone down through them it painted a scene of dreary and desolate beauty. The light looked like dark yellow dragons roving through the skies. The air in this place was filled with quite a bit of dust, giving it a dreamlike quality. Where was the cliff? There was no cliff. It wasn't just the skies which were as dark as dusk. The world for 1,000 kilometers around him consisted of nothing more than strewn boulders and rolling plains. There were no hills to speak of, much less cliffs. However, an ancient yet beautiful ruins was standing there silently within the empty lands. These ruins appeared to be far more ancient than any of the wasteland's ruins which Cloudhawk had seen in the past, and it was completely stylistically different from those ruins as well. The vast majority of the buildings looked like erect stone pillars, while the others looked like perfectly formed geometrical shapes. There were pyramids, there were cubes, there were spheres, there were octahedrons, and more. Although they had been baptized by wind and dust for countless years, the vast majority of them continued to stand tall. Every single building was covered with decorative script that linked together in complex, abstruse diagrams that seemed to follow a certain cadence or rhythm. These things definitely didn't come from any age or era on Earth. The area around them was littered with many bones from gigantic monsters, and judging from the size of the bones these behemoths had to have been at least 100 meters long. Cloudhawk found all of this incredibly hard to believe. There was no way this was the world he lived in. Although he had no clue what was going on, it seemed likely that in the moment when his life hung in the balance, he had managed to somehow accidentally activate that strange stone. He had awakened it, causing it to release its energies and teleport Cloudhawk to this place. Something like this had already happened once. Cloudhawk had experienced something similar a year or so ago, when he had been forced into those tunnels. He still clearly remembered how he had been teleported to a place which had 2 suns, but the strange thing was, this time he had been sent to a completely different place. Were the locations the stone sent him to chosen at random? Then where was he now? Cloudhawk felt joy at having survived in the face of certain death, but he was also filled with confusion and fear of the unknown. What if he was the only person in this entire world? Would he be trapped here forever? What was he to do? Cloudhawk thought back to the mercenaries and the miserable deaths they had died. They had all died for him. Now that the man in black had killed the mercenaries, his next target would definitely be the blood-soaked queen. Cloudhawk had to take revenge for Tartarus. He had to go back and warn the queen. And he had to kill that detestable demon. Cloudhawk clenched the stone around his neck and shouted, "Send me back. You hear me? Send me back now." The stone had once more fallen silent. No matter how Cloudhawk shook it, it didn't react at all. Cloudhawk had no choice but to put it aside for now. At least he had managed to survive, so long as he was alive, he'd find a way to get back. He forced himself to calm down, then began to search within the ruins. The ruins were enormous in size and scale, just the ordinary stone pillars were over 100 meters tall. Cloudhawk was like an ant in comparison, slowly winding his way through the strewn stones. Far off in the distance, there was an incredibly vast rectangular stone stele that had a statue on each side. The statues weren't of humans, they were of some sort of strange creature which he had never seen before. Cloudhawk wasn't interested in statues, nor was he interested in the buildings. He was, however, intrigued when he discovered an opening within the rectangular stone stele. He was wind-beaten and completely parched. He couldn't just keep on wasting his remaining energy just running around randomly. He decided to first go inside the building and rest for a time. The passageway into the building was extremely large, and its walls were lined with clear, intricate paintings. Although Cloudhawk didn't recognize the strange script, he could more or less understand that the images were depicting the people of this world undergoing some sort of religious ritual. Cloudhawk was in no mood to examine things more closely, however, because he discovered to his amazement that the insides of the building were lit. The light seemed to come from the walls, the pillars, the ceiling, and even the floor itself. The strange material which this building was made of seemed to have absorbed light from the outside world and then released it from the inside. So long as there was light outside, the insides of the building would never fall dark. Cloudhawk didn't understand by what principles this worked, nor did he care to. Suddenly, Cloudhawk froze. He could vaguely sense a strange ripple in the air, a ripple which he was extremely familiar with. It had to be a divine relic generating this ripple. Cloudhawk nervously called out, "Who's there?" But the only response was his voice echoing within the empty building. Cloudhawk pulled out his exorcist staff, slowly and casually advancing towards the source of the ripples. After moving past multiple pillars, he finally found the source. It was actually a man dressed in voluminous robes who was kneeling on the ground, his back facing Cloudhawk. There was no way to see his face from behind, but Cloudhawk could tell that an extremely thick layer of dust was covering this man's body, so thick that it seemed as though the man had become part of the building itself. Cloudhawk slowly turned his gaze higher. The black-robed man was facing what looked like an absolutely enormous idol. Due to the overall dimness of the lighting, Cloudhawk wasn't able to tell what the idol looked like exactly. Cloudhawk walked over, using his tri-bladed exorcist staff to poke the kneeling man. As soon as Cloudhawk did this, the robes completely fell collapsed in an explosion of dust, revealing corroded bones underneath. Cloudhawk couldn't help but start to cough. Ah, shit. It was someone who had died so long ago that even most of his bones had disintegrated. Cloudhawk picked up the black robes and gave them a good shake, causing a large amount of bone dust to come flying out from it. Apparently, this was actually some sort of hooded cloak. Wait, this is a relic. The hooded cloak had endured the passage of 1,000 winters without being destroyed. Cloudhawk had no idea what the thing was made out of, but it felt completely weightless in his hands. Although it looked rather grimy and ugly, it felt extremely glossy and sleek to the touch. However, what truly intrigued Cloudhawk was the fact that it was emanating the ripples of a divine relic. Cloudhawk revealed a look of excitement. He then turned, reaching out and flipping through the shards of bone on the ground. He had spent over a year studying dissection and anatomy alongside Mantis, and so he was very familiar with the human skeletal structure. Clearly, these bones did not belong to humans. However, that didn't really matter. What mattered was the fact that Cloudhawk found yet another object amongst the bones which emanated relic ripples. This object looked like a gourd. It was palm-sized and fiery red, but covered in dark golden runes. Judging from the strength of the ripples, this was probably a relic of quite some power. It was at least on par with the sacred crossblade of light which the blood-soaked queen used, and it was possibly even stronger. So this is a demon hunter's skeleton. Cloudhawk stared at the bones littering the ground, puzzled. This place clearly was not any part of the world which Cloudhawk came from. Why, then, did it also have demon hunters? And the corpse had been kneeling towards this idol. Were these the so-called gods? Cloudhawk wiped the two divine relics clean, then gave them a close look. He discovered to his great surprise that the hooded cloak and the gourd both had a strange insignia on them. He pulled out his relic to compare them to the one on his exorcist staff, only to discover that the insignias were virtually identical. But before he had a chance to thoroughly think through the implications of this, a deep hiss could be heard coming from outside the hall. Cloudhawk's entire body tensed up as a sense of tremendous danger filled his mind. By the time Cloudhawk turned to look towards the direction from which the sound came, an enormous shadow could be seen slowly crawling forward past the stone columns. What the hell is this? A giant snake. But this is huge. The creature's torso alone was 4 or 5 times thicker than Cloudhawk, and its body was indescribably long. It coiled its body around one of the stone columns, its ashen-white scales glittering with cold, metallic light. Hisses could be heard from the other direction as well. Cloudhawk discovered, to his horror, that there wasn't just one of these creatures inside. Every single pillar had these creatures slowly coiling their way downwards. Each creature was indescribably vast, and Cloudhawk had been completely surrounded. One of the giant, ashen-white creatures descended to the ground from the pillar closest to Cloudhawk. It slowly extended its head, and when Cloudhawk was able to see it clearly he felt his scalp go numb. It had the body of a giant serpent, but the head was that of a lion's and its eyes glowed with cold green light. Suddenly, the beast charged straight towards Cloudhawk, moving as fast as a streak of lightning. Cloudhawk had never seen a terrifying monster like this before. Most likely, even if the entire Tartarus company came back to life, the only result would be them being wiped out a second time, and there were dozens of the things. But just as the monster opened its great maw and bit down, the strange stone around Cloudhawk's neck suddenly woke up once more, releasing a stream of light that caused him to disappear just as the jaws closed around him. Cloudhawk was back in the wastelands once more. What was going on, exactly? Cloudhawk stared in silent shock as the strange stone slowly dimmed once more. This time, it seemed to have fallen into an even deeper state of slumber. The hooded cloak and small gourd in Cloudhawk's hands was proof that it hadn't all been just a dream. He really had visited an unimaginably strange world, then returned with divine relics that did not belong to the wastelands. Cloudhawk was vaguely beginning to understand the nature of the abilities of this strange stone. Why did it have this sort of abilities? How were all of these worlds connected? These were mysteries for Cloudhawk to work through later. Right now, the most pressing thing at hand was for him to immediately return to Black Flag Outpost. It was possible that the battle had already begun and that the blood-soaked queen was in grave danger. Cloudhawk scanned the area around him. He was lucky enough to recognize it as a place they had crossed earlier, and he was able to find the vehicles which the Tartarus mercenaries had parked out in the wastelands. He pulled out a canteen of water, gulping it down and enjoying the sensation of its cool moisture flooding his body. Cloudhawk then clambered onto the Iron Lizard, then revved up the engine. He had done plenty of maintenance work on the vehicles during the past few weeks. Although he hadn't actually driven them, he knew how they worked. As for the actual driving, he'd learn it on the go. The Iron Lizard slowly began to work its way across the wastelands, accelerating to greater and greater speeds. This was his first time driving, and Cloudhawk was every bit as crazy a driver as the mercenaries had been. Right now, Cloudhawk had only one thing in his mind: he was going to get back as soon as he could, then run some of those bastards over. Book 1, Chapter 47 The Fallen Outpost. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The setting sun continued to bake the wastelands with its scorching, parching, and blazing light. The gates to Black Flag Outpost were tightly shut. Men hefted weapons in their hands, arranged in tight ranks as they waited patiently. Thousands of bloodshot eyes scanned the wilderness. It had been 2 days and 2 nights since any of them had slept. Facing them was an army of more than 1,000 sweepers arrayed in a dense formation. Where did these sweepers come from? What did these sweepers want? No one knew. 2 days ago, the mutants had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. They surrounded the outpost but didn't attack it, just staring at it from afar. The warriors of Black Flag Outpost were kept in a constant state of tense nervousness. They didn't dare to fall asleep, and their nerves were shot. They were close to the point of mental collapse. The sweepers were led by two commanders. The first was a beak-faced youth who had wings and could fly in the air. The second was a muscular man with two curved ox-like horns and whose skin seemed to be made out of some sort of black metal. The winged youth looked rather impatient as he irritably scraped his twin scimitars against each other. Why is our big brother taking so much time to deal with a few miserable mercenaries? Black Flag Outpost is no big deal anyhow. The two of us are more than enough to wipe it out. Let's just start. Did you forget how our little brother died? The horned man was seated on a rock, and he spoke in a deep and patient voice that was completely different from his brutish appearance. Wait a bit longer. Don't get impatient. The winged man couldn't fathom what his brother was worried about. Surely you don't think that bitch is stronger than our master. We can't rule out that there may be traps. The master must be vigilant, he protects from the shadows, doesn't fight from the front. The horned fellow swung his eyes toward his companion. In the grand scheme our lives don't mean shit. Our job is to make sure not even the smallest danger threatens the master. The winged man was silent, he knew second brother was right. There were forces at play in the wasteland they paled in comparison to. The wasteland needed a master. Just then a cry broke the relative silence. A ragged wasteland airship was coming their way, kicking up a torrent of wind and sand. It was 100 meters tall and split the twilight horizon as it made its way toward Black Flag Outpost. Was he finally back? Could they start the slaughter? Excitement gleamed dangerously in the winged man's eyes. His horned companion unfurled from atop the rock and stood. All of a sudden a fierce wind was kicked up all around them. Billowing clouds of sand arose as though they'd been stirred up by giant, invisible hands. The clouds swirled around and around until they became a tornado. The outpost's defenders were stunned as they witnessed the supernatural disaster form before their eyes. Shit! The hell is this? As though on cue the tornado tore forward, throwing everything in its path high into the sand-choked air. The sound of it was like 100,000 rattlesnakes beating their tails. The cries of elite soldiers hollered out to the others. Hit the deck. Half a moment later the tornado struck the makeshift parapets and tore it to shreds. 10 soldiers were flung into the sky like detritus, even their screams were lost to the deadly sands. Nearby buildings of weaker construction were reduced to rubble by the tugging winds alone. As the summoned storm pierced the outpost's defenses, it rapidly started to decay. Far from being a cause to celebrate, however, it spat out plumes of sand in all directions and blinded the defenders. As their world was cast into a choking fog, chaos erupted among the outpost warriors. A crazed fanaticism burned in the horned man's eyes. Master blesses us with cover. Tear this place apart. The winged commander let loose a howl of excitement. His wings beat furiously, thrusting him into the air and leaving whirling dust devils in his wake. He shot like a bullet into the sky, to the chorus of bloodthirsty cries from the sweepers below. Together they advanced through the wind and sand toward Black Flag Outpost's crumbling walls. At last, the battle had begun. They're coming. Everyone, get ready for a fight. Warriors shuffled through the unnatural darkness, rushing to try and maintain some sort of defensive formation. One wastelander clambered over the wall and met the defenders with a swing of its heavy axe. It cut through a warrior's head with a sickening crunch before being wrenched free and turned on another. Blood-curdling howls echoed through the sandy darkness. The two sides clashed. There were 3 times as many sweepers this time as there were in the last assault, while Black Flag Outpost's defenses had taken a big hit. What remained of their elite squad used their survivability and organization to rally the defenders and prepare for the desperate fight. A shadow stretched over them. Peering through the stinging sands, the outpost's fighters could make out an oval shape lumbering through the skies above them. It was the black-clad man's airship. That was about as far as their thoughts went before they were interrupted by a series of cracks. Ah! Arfk! Ag! A hail of bullets descended on them, ripping through the defenders and turning them into howling fountains of blood. What flesh and blood creature could survive a tempest of hot lead? It was spat from a rare treasure of the wastelands, a minigun bolted to the frame of the airship. Already it was clear which side held the advantage. Disaster had befallen the outpost warriors. Wherever the enemy airship passed, it left piles of corpses and rivers of blood in its wake. Sweepers broke through the walls in droves to swarm over the hellscape and look for victims. Men, women, children, it didn't matter, if it breathed it was torn apart. Could this even be called a battle? It was genocide. Black Flag Outpost had fallen. This bastion of society in the wasteland was no more. The blood-soaked queen walked through the slaughter, swaying slightly with every step. All of these people were dead because of her. Although she was a child of the gods, a noble demon hunter who spurned these heathens, witnessing their heartless massacre wasn't something she could simply put out of mind. They were lives of ignorance and evil, but they were lives nonetheless. No question remained as to who would win this conflict. The overwhelming numbers and advantages of the sweepers proved too much for the outpost. Even if she were stronger, the blood-soaked queen couldn't turn this foul situation round. Black Flag Outpost was destined to be wiped into obscurity. Its denizens were either consigned to rot as corpses, or fled in whatever direction their legs would take them. All the while there were screams, blood, murder, brutality. How could anyone not be scarred by this nightmare? A group of 4 or 5 sweepers came across the blood-soaked queen. They immediately brandished their axes and, with a guttural battle cry, flung themselves at her. In one fluid movement the queen kicked her foot, lifting an iron sword that had been half buried in the dirt. She caught it in midair, and before the mob could even draw close they were met by streaks of cold light. Precise, deadly, vicious. One after the other the sweepers fell to the ground, spurting blood from their open throats. Demon hunters were the mightiest warriors of the Elysian lands. Even if absent their godly relics, no typical enemy could stand against them. Out of the wind-born sands a cluster of bone-tipped tentacles shot forth. They whipped and cut through the air like a meat grinder, fast and cruel. Erratic and deadly, the sudden attack was practically impossible to defend against. Clang, crack, bang. The crude iron sword in the queen's grip seemed to take on a life of its own. Like a viper it lashed out at the tentacles, blocking each one. None managed to slip past her cover. A shrill cry rang out from overhead. What little light remained glinted off of a pair of machetes, carving a deadly path her way. They were aimed to meet at the snow-white flesh of her neck, ready to sever her head from her body. The blood-soaked queen reeled backward just in time. She could only see the light of the machetes as it flit by, shaving several hairs in its passage. A moment later a figure appeared behind her bearing the offending weapons. Fast as lightning, the shadow struck again. She swung the sword around and held it backwards in her grip. Clang! The iron sword knocked the machetes away. Next the earth shook beneath her feet, followed by a thunderous roar and the sound of splintering stone. From the corner of her eye she saw a massive figure, pitch black, burst through a structure on her left. The wall didn't appear to slow this monster down in the least, and it bore down on the queen like a bloodthirsty rhinoceros. Again she swung her sword around to meet this new threat. What followed was the grating sound of steel breaking apart. The blood-soaked queen staggered backwards with the ruins of a sword in hand. The sheer force of the impact had practically turned her weapon to dust. Whoever this foe was, they had strength to surpass both Grizzly and Mad Dog. Protecting yourself from a combined attack with nothing but a crude sword. The unsettling man in black emerged from the sandstorm. On his left was the bull-horned monster that had nearly flattened her. On his right was a younger warrior with a pair of wings. They glared hungrily at the powerful queen for a time before the black-clad aberration spoke again in its low, gravelly voice. Blood-soaked queen is a well-earned moniker. As he spoke, figures began to close in on them, silhouettes barely visible through the sand. They revealed themselves to be 20 elite sweepers, with bows drawn and arrows nocked. All deadlier weapons than the splinters of the queen's ruined sword. Her face hidden behind the demonic mask, none of the queen's assailants knew what she was thinking. Almost flippantly she cast the hilt of her ruined weapon aside. Her bare hands were quickly filled with balls of roiling flame. These 3 mutants were not your typical foe. The one in black, she knew, could regenerate quickly. Only a single, definitive attack could put him down, otherwise he was practically impossible to kill. The bull-horned man-beast was strength-focused, and a single blow from him would either cripple or outright kill her. The winged youth was possessed of supernatural agility, with great speed and keen reaction time. Against him, life or death could be decided in the blink of an eye. Against the 3 of them even the demon hunter was outmatched. She needed to use relics. The blood-soaked queen, mighty as she was, had her limits. Battling against these 3 mutants, how could she protect herself from this host of assassins that had surrounded her? What's more, she hadn't fully recovered from her wounds, and quickly dispatching of her 3 most irritating assailants would be no easy task. The black man's voice slithered out, cold as the grave. Kill her. The twang of bows loosing their payload filled the air. The queen threw herself behind a collapsed wall, causing the deadly bolts to bury themselves in her cover. With a gleeful cry the winged mutant shot into the air, only to descend upon her like a meteor. The man in black and the horned warrior raced after her on the ground. They converged on her in an instant. 10 sweepers were right on their heels. She could be twice as strong, and still the queen was outnumbered. Not only did she have to dodge arrows fired from the darkness, she also had to protect herself from the 3 mutants and a contingent of sweepers. Thud. The queen felt something strike her shoulder and a spray of blood spat forth. She'd been struck by a sniper, injured. With perfect timing the winged man attacked with his machetes. The cunning monster in black lashed out with its whip-like tentacles. The twin-horned man charged ahead regardless of obstacle, flailing his inky-black fists. Wrath, indignation and cold-blooded homicidal intent sprang up in the blood-soaked queen's eyes. She clenched her right fist and her glove burst into flame. She lashed out, and like a belching flame from a dragon's maw a plume of fire erupted outward. For all his girth and muscle, the bull-horned mutant was blasted several meters away like a ragdoll. Book 1, Chapter 48 Knock M Flying. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The blood-soaked queen had 2 divine relics. One was the burning angel, while the other was the sacred crossblade of light. Both were relics from her clan, with the burning angel being the glove she wore on her hand. Legends claimed that if the demon hunter was powerful enough, a touch from the burning angels could set anything ablaze. Wood, stone, even iron, a caress was enough to make it belch fire. Flammable or not, the power of the relic consumed all. Though the blood-soaked queen was not as powerful as the legends described, she could incinerate any flesh and blood obstacle within her reach. No amount of luck could protect her victim once she laid hands on them. However, when her strike landed it didn't feel like hitting flesh. It felt like metal. The horned man was wreathed in flame, but they did not reach any vital part of him. The mutant rolled around in the sand for a moment to quench the fires, and it was revealed the only result was a scorched mark on his chest. Certainly nothing to threaten his life. The man in black hissed a mocking laugh. Second brother has the strongest defenses. Even for a young demon hunter you are weak. Did you honestly believe you were strong enough to face our master? So na.ve. What I didn't expect, the queen said through her mask, was that your master would be so fond of raising stupid mutts. None of them were offended or enraged by her insult, for they agreed. Each of them were proud to be loyal servants of the master, vicious dogs in his service. They would tear the throats out of whoever he told them to without ever questioning who or why. Are you demon hunters any different? Dogs as well, with gods who hold your tether. We're no different, you and I. You refuse to accept reality, and harass us because of your dogmatic assumptions. What gives you the right to be so self-righteous? Do you think you understand the wastelands at all? What right do you have to pass judgment on us? The black-clad mutant waved his hand. The sweepers raised their weapons, ready to put her down for good. The blood-soaked queen bolted from her hiding place like a bat out of hell. The thud of bullets and crossbow bolts followed her, buried in the sand inches from her heels. She was shadowed by the winged mutant who descended from on high. He held his machetes reversed in his grip but cut with such speed and ferocity it seemed there were dozens of strikes raining down. The queen thrust out her hands, fingers curled in like a tiger's claw. With staggering accuracy she caught the winged man's blurred machetes out of the air and poured the power coalesced in her palms right through them. They immediately began to glow with white-hot heat. With a yelp the winged man's hands went slack and he was blasted away. The black-garbed man and his horned companion charged in for another attempt. The man in black attacked first, lashing out with 5 viper-like tentacles. With startling accuracy they splayed out toward specific targets, her face, throat, chest and other vital parts. They hissed through the air like arrows from 100 archers, seeking her heart with a shrill whistling cadence. The horned man's attacks weren't flashy or even terribly skilled. He relied on overwhelming strength, and so intense was the punch that its effects were felt even before they landed. Punch after punch, propelled by pure force mighty enough to level mountains. The blood-soaked queen was knocked back, and the assault slowed her escape. It was only a little, but enough. One of the bullets found its mark and buried itself in her thigh. She lost her balance. The blood-soaked queen bit back her pain. She focused more energy into her hands, gripping tight to the machetes wrenched from the winged man. They glowed red, and when she threw them they became discs of molten steel. Both of them erupted in midair and set searing shrapnel flying out in every direction. The pained whines and howls of sweepers answered. The queen stumbled, rolled, and shot back to her feet. The wound in her leg was deep and bright fresh blood oozed freely from it, but she didn't have time to examine the injury now. The 5 tentacles of the black-garbed monster were on her, and the horned behemoth was bearing down on her position. She managed to dodge the tentacles, but in doing so left herself open to the horned beast's fists. As his blow landed she was thrown through the ruined buildings of the outpost like a marionette with its string severed. He was monstrous, a single successful hit nearly broke her in half. Kill her. The sweepers raised their weapons, training them on the queen. Gnarled fingers applied pressure to hair triggers when suddenly shouts rang up that caught their attention. A group of outpost warriors who had rallied together were charging at the twisted beasts. Caught unprepared, they were quickly cut down. The blood-soaked queen took this opportunity to flee. She struggled to move as quickly as she could, despite her grievous wounds. We can't defend the outpost. Queen, we must retreat. Grizzly put his fist through one of the sweepers' heads like it was an overripe melon. He was covered in blood, some his but mostly others, as he hurried to the queen's side. When he saw that she had not suffered any life-threatening wounds he breathed a sigh of relief. However, her injuries were anything but slight, and that filled him with an indescribable fury. These fucking bastards. They dared harm my queen. Grizzly had managed to assemble 10 elite fighters and 20 to 30 conscripts. They weren't a strong unit by any means, but they would serve in an emergency. At the very least they could pin down a sizable group of sweepers. The blood-soaked queen knew that now was not the time to tarry and fight war. With Cloudhawk's help she'd recovered from her wounds, but not completely. She was only capable of commanding a little more than 60% of her full strength. Besides being less than at her peak, she'd also suffered wounds to her shoulder and leg. The punch that horned bastard had landed also caused considerable internal damage. Keeping up the fight was ill-advised. Grizzly screamed at her with all the force of his namesake. Go! Sinister, snake-like laughter hissed through the air. You think you can get away? The winged youth skimmed low over the ground and snapped up a long knife from the ground. A group of soldiers moved to stop him but were viciously cut down. The man in black and the horned titan moved in for the kill. Despite the efforts of the soldiers, sweepers were closing in on all sides. Warriors started dropping like flies. Their circle of defiance was quickly shrinking. Grizzly punched one of the wastelanders so hard his chest caved. He swung around to face his next foe, and found himself face to face with an enormous specimen. He was pitch black, and two enormous horns rose from its skull. Get the fuck out of my way. Grizzly didn't give a damn who his enemy was. He snapped a jab with his iron-clad hand aimed for the horned mutant's chest. His foe didn't dodge or block. The punch connected and the horned man staggered back several steps. A small rivulet of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, but otherwise the beast was unfazed. What? Grizzly looked at the mutant, dumbfounded. He was one of the strongest fighters in the outpost, matched only by Tartarus Captain, Mad Dog. The horned man didn't seem to care though. He didn't block or move, he just took the punch like it was nothing. The Titan wiped the blood from his mouth. He glared at Grizzly with dark, murderous eyes. You've got some strength. But not enough. He punctuated his words with a full-armed punch. Grizzly paid his words no mind. When he saw the fist, he answered by throwing one of his own. They met mid-air with such force that it sounded like thunder. It was followed by the sound of splintering bone and Grizzly's ear-splitting cries. He crumbled to the ground, cradling what remained of his hand. The iron glove was dented and inside his fingers were a mangled mess. His arm had become an amorphous ruin of bone flecks and tenderized meat. Jagged bits of bone jutted out in several places. Grizzly. The gasps came from members of the elite squad. They rushed forward to drag their wounded leader out of danger. Grizzly was no less a powerhouse than the captains of Tartarus Company. None of them expected he would be so badly maimed going fist for fist. His whole right arm had been practically destroyed. Even if he survived, Grizzly would be forever crippled. At least he could take heart in the fact that the horned man was also bleeding. Except, this copper-skinned, iron-bone monstrosity had just scraped his knuckles. The blood-soaked queen looked upon Grizzly as he wailed and cradled what was left of his hand. She looked on as one after the other, her elite soldiers were cut down like weeds. Each death fanned the flames of rage in her eyes. Was she not a prideful person? She had come from faraway lands to hunt and kill demons, but she hadn't even managed to catch a glimpse of her prey. Now here she was, with men she found base and filthy dying to protect her. She reached up to curl her fingers around the cross hanging from her neck. Using her holy sword to eliminate a few mutants shouldn't be too much to expect. She knew, however, that summoning the blade would overtax her abilities. It meant she wouldn't have any strength left over to protect herself against whatever foes may follow, not to mention the bastard still hidden somewhere in the shadows. The circle of protection was shrinking. She saw her warriors dying by the moment and knew now was not the time for indecision. She gripped the necklace tight and prepared to yank it free. The man in black spotted this minute detail. Careful. She's getting desperate, he didn't finish his sentence. A scene completely outside of their expectations emerged, heralded by a roar that shook the heavens. A vehicle came barreling through the fog of sand like a hellish lizard scrambling across the dunes. Destructive as a bulldozer, it ripped a path straight toward Black Flag Outpost, knocking countless sweepers or grinding them beneath its wheels. And it was headed right for the freak in black. Get fucked. Cloudhawk roared within the driver's seat, his crimson eyes fixed on his target. With utter disregard for everything he stomped hard on the accelerator. Before the freak could react, it was plowed down and caught in the tread of several tires. No small number of sweepers were also reduced to roadkill as the iron lizard ripped through their ranks. Cloudhawk lost control. The iron lizard pitched hard to its side and ripped itself apart against the unforgiving ground. This didn't stop its forward motion, however, and several pieces went barreling toward the horned mutant, standing stunned not far away. Erf. The bull-like beast roared a challenge and flung his arms up defensively. But he was no match for several tons of twisted metal. He was caught in the tide of detritus that only came to a stop when it pulverized itself against a cluster of buildings. It wasn't clear whether the mutant survived. Wide-eyed and slack-jawed, the winged man and the remaining sweepers gaped at what they'd just witnessed. What in the hell? A bloody hand clawed out of the cabin. A young man in dingy ash-black fur armor clambered from the wreckage. He'd lived, but the gash in his head and the blood that covered him said he didn't escape without a price. Cloudhawk shook his head to try and clear away his blurred vision. The first thing he saw was something pinned beneath the wheels of the iron lizard. It was the masked man. God damn. You still aren't dead. You still aren't dead. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't far off, either. His lower body had been badly mangled by the vehicle's tires. His incredible healing was the only thing that kept him breathing. It's you. The man in black pushed his body up with his right arm and glared at the child. He couldn't believe this mercenary punk had survived. Cloudhawk stared back with eyes painted the color of blood. He pulled his exorcist staff free and began to drag himself forward. Step by step he lurched toward the man in black. He stared at the young man as he came closer, inch by agonizing inch. And as he did, a sensation filled him, one that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He had faced some of the fiercest creatures of the wasteland, but he'd never felt it until now. Fear. Book 1, Chapter 49. The Last Frenzy. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Cloudhawk's dramatic entrance had stunned everyone. This heedless, crazy action in a critical moment dealt with two of the enemy leaders. This kid was as crazy as he was lucky. The man in black was pinned and couldn't move. The mask that concealed his face had broken away, revealing a hideously ugly visage beneath. He had all the humanoid features, eyes, a nose, a mouth. But all along his jaw and the ridge of his cheekbone there grew spindly threads of flesh. They were like miniature tentacles that spread from his face. They slithered across his countenance like they had a mind of their own. The last leader standing, the winged youth, screamed and launched into the air. He dove for them, sword first. Cloudhawk felt the danger, but he knew his foe was too fast for him to defend against. With singular focus he poured his will into the exorcist staff. Its tri-bladed head began to spin, gaining momentum with each step until it was kicking up sand. Everyone, the man in black, the winged man, and the blood-soaked queen, they all stared in wonderment. He's a demon hunter. The two mutants were stunned. He was a kid, but he was a kid with an exorcist staff, and that made everything different. Could Black Flag Outpost have another demon hunter? The winged mutant's blade hung in the air for half a breath as he hesitated. In that moment a dark figure leapt from the ruins nearby, and almost unseen threw something toward him. Two scalpels, dripping with poison, whistled through the air. One was angled toward the jugular notch, and the other for his chest. Mantis. The assassin was a master at taking advantage of opportunities. The winged attacker was forced to break off his assault on Cloudhawk and turn his sword toward protecting himself. He succeeded in knocking the deadly scalpels away. The power of the exorcist staff continued to gather to its peak. Tempestuous winds were kicked up all around Cloudhawk and his demon-slaying weapon. A ferocious and hateful look was smeared across the tentacle horror's face. He whipped his left hand and cast his bone-tipped feelers toward Cloudhawk. However, he'd been gravely injured, causing both his power and speed to suffer. Mantis reacted with another pair of flying knives that connected with two of the tentacles, knocking them away and helping Cloudhawk evade the danger. Cloudhawk lifted his staff high. With eyes red as the pits of hell, he brought the spinning blades down as hard as he could upon the man in black. The mutant tried to protect himself with his right arm, but the spinning blade would not be deterred. It ground against the limb, tearing through flesh and bone with the sound of half a dozen saws. The freak's arm was making a serviceable yet painful stand, stopping the exorcist's staff from hitting anything vital. "Are you angry?" the monster hissed in his gravelly tone. "Do you feel the hatred?" By now the man in black's other wounds had healed. Two slithering bone-tipped tentacles reeled back and struck at Cloudhawk like a pair of cobras. "You don't have what it takes to kill me. Die." Scenes flashed through Cloudhawk's mind. The satisfied look in Woola's dull, dead eyes. Cook's unreconciled sadness and anger. Mad Dog's silhouette as he welcomed death, and Slyfox's earnest look moments before his demise. Those eyes, that hatred, that figure, all of these things crystallized in a single moment in his mind. Cloudhawk felt something surge within him, like a dam had burst. The sound of his exorcist's staff drilling through his foe's arm increased, and the black man watched in agonizing terror as it tore his limb to ground flesh. "Let's see who dies first." His exorcist's staff became an all-conquering Excalibur. He thrust his staff through the arm, into the freak's throat and deeper still into the earth beneath. The whirling blade made quick work of the mutant's neck and its hideous head rolled into the distance. A rapidly expanding pool of black blood soaked the ground. Suddenly Cloudhawk was stabbed by a pain that radiated from his back. Two of the man in black's bone spurs dug themselves in. Thankfully they were weak, and the quality of his wolf pelt was good. The wounds were not too bad. The winged man's eyes went wide with rage. "Big brother." Sweepers who'd witnessed the scene were struck dumb with amazement. In fact, so was the blood-soaked queen. She felt like the notions she'd built herself on for the last decade were wrong. How could a heretic from the wastes be capable of wielding a demon hunter's weapon, and so capably at that? His attack had been vicious and destructive. Not only did he summon the power of the relic, but his will surpassed any novice demon hunter she'd ever known. He was almost as good as a full-fledged member of the order. Training a demon hunter in the Elysian lands required significant time, resources, and energy. No one had ever heard of a recruit mastering the craft in a matter of days, much less someone with his power and psychic strength. This was absolutely impossible. The winged man's roars brought her and the sweepers back to the present. "Kill them." Mantis swept in and grabbed Cloudhawk, who was almost too weak to walk. Like a specter, he glided to her side. "I know a way. Follow or die." There was no time to be stunned. Several elite soldiers, the badly wounded Grizzly, and the Queen were all who remained. They stumbled after Mantis, looking for escape. The winged mutant gave up the chase. His first concern was his mangled brother. As he knelt down beside him, the winged man could see the tentacles on his neck and face twitching erratically. His mangled collarbones had sprouted many new tentacles as well. The winged mutant let out a sigh of relief. The black-robed freak had almost perfect healing powers and was a metahuman with an extremely complex internal structure. As a result, even though he had suffered a mortal wound that he wouldn't be able to recover from quickly, his cells and his organs would still remain active and lively for a period of time. The winged man scooped up his head and brought it to its body. He held it close to the hacked remnants of his neck. The tentacles reaching from it were like worms with a scent for a feast. They slithered over each other and tugged the head tight while sickly flesh began to re-stitch itself. Tendons, vessels, and muscle regenerated before their very eyes. Cloudhawk had almost killed him. Almost. The crumbling protests of rock thundered around them as a boulder was thrust aside. The Horned Brother came stomping out from the ruins, looking worse than his wounds truly felt. His fuming gaze swept the area. Where'd they go? This is unbelievable. The winged man had to keep helping his elder brother recover. He shouted over his shoulder at the Horned Man. They couldn't have fled far, get after them. The bull-like mutant gathered a group of 30 of 40 sweepers and gave chase. Black Flag Outpost was lost to the enemy. Everywhere one turned there were citizens fighting for their lives. There were more defenders than sweepers, but one-on-one they were no match. This was before considering the sweepers' airship and its heavy guns. No one knew how many were mowed down, but the trickles of blood had become rivers. Enemies are everywhere, inside the walls and all around them, said the crestfallen grizzly. How do we get out? Mantis acted like he heard nothing and continued to pick his way ahead without hesitation. As they continued, suddenly they found the sand beneath them get kicked up by a buffeting wind. The sweeper airship was above them. Grizzly looked up with dispirited surprise. Not good. A Spitfire crackle filled the air as its minigun burst to life. The area around them exploded into debris as bullets went flying. A few of the slower fighters fell to the ground screaming, shooting geysers of blood from their wounds. The airship had them pinned down. Cloudhawk was so drained he was having trouble putting one foot in front of the other. Grizzly and the blood-soaked Queen were seriously injured. It made them slow and vulnerable. The enemy vessel descended to 10 meters overhead and continued to spray the area with bullet fire. Escape was impossible. Mantis continued at a full run, suddenly changing directions toward an excavation pit. These pits were where diggers did their namesake, searching for relics and other treasures. Most of the outpost's goods, be they vehicles, weapons or tools, came from pits like this. Many of them were dotted around the territory. This was shut down years ago when nothing of value was discovered. That's where Mantis was going. Some of these dig sites were honeycombs of secret passages that ran deep and far underground. They seemed to stretch on everywhere and pop up at various places through the outpost. Even Grizzly, after years of leading the elite squad, had no idea these were here. The dwindling group filed into the tunnels, sweepers nipping at their heels. Outside, the horned mutant ripped off a corroded iron plate from some junk nearby and hurled it like a frisbee into the tunnel after them. Ack! The sheet of metal buried itself into one of the soldiers. It had cut halfway through his waist before getting lodged. Shit! They're still after us. The survivors scowled. None of them wanted to accept that their enemies had caught up to them so fast. They fired a salvo of gunfire through the tunnel and several more defenders were killed. Mantis and the Queen immediately took over. Grizzly was a fraction too slow and a bullet tore through his ankle. His towering body crashed into the ground with a thud. Grizzly! Cloudhawk cried. The blood-soaked Queen grabbed the big man and dragged him into cover. Grizzly, soaked with sweat, gaped at her in astonishment. He was here, right next to her. In the year he'd served with her he'd never been this close. The sweepers were closing in. I can walk on my own. Cloudhawk pushed at Mantis as he felt his strength returning. Go help Grizzly. No, it's not needed. Grizzly swung his eyes to Cloudhawk and fixed him with a solemn gaze. I'll keep em off you. Protect the Queen, and get the fuck outta here. Grizzly's right arm was in splinters, as was his ankle. He knew that he'd only slow them down. Mantis knew it too. He didn't hesitate. The last Tartarus captain pulled Cloudhawk up and they fled down the tunnel. And although the Queen felt her chest tighten, she knew the truth when she saw it. What she never knew was how he felt. For a year Grizzly served as her loyal attendant. He was giving his life so they could run, trading it for the briefest chance she and the others could live. It weighed heavy on her. The queen couldn't remember when she started pitying these barbarians. She'd grown up in the blessed country where they warned her constantly that the wastelands were full of evil. The people of God and the wretches of the wastelands were split by an impassable line. She was taught never to show the faithless mercy or sympathy. Her experience in these blighted lands taught her that these unfortunate souls weren't much different from the people where she came from. Everyone was made from the same flesh and blood. Everyone loved, everyone loathed. The cold fingers of dread closed around her heart. Was she questioning her faith? No, no, the word of the God surpassed all else. She looked back over her shoulder. Grizzly had himself half propped up, leaning on his good leg and looking back at her. For the briefest instant their eyes met and he felt like he was bathed in holy light. The look in her eyes set his soul ablaze. This is enough, he thought. He was content to die for what he believed in. Could many in these cursed lands say the same? Click. A spout of fire danced from his lighter as Grizzly lit a cigarette. He seemed unperturbed as the shadow of an enormous horned monstrosity crept over him. Grizzly sucked in a breath, making the tobacco crackle. He looked at the mutant with a calm and determined gaze, like a man standing vigil before the dawn. I'm not lettin' you through. The horned man curled his fist, making his knuckles pop ominously. His dark eyes were thick with disdain. Just you? Yeah. Just me. He plucked the cigarette from his lips and flicked it away. Keeping his eyes locked on the mutant, he tore open his shirt to reveal a vest of homemade explosives. Half an inch of fuse sizzled as he grinned victoriously at his killer. You're going down with me. The horned man's pupils contracted to tiny dots. He screamed at those behind him. Retreat. The sweepers scrambled over one another to try and flee. Grizzly erupted into peals of crazy laughter, full of pride and rage and madness. Tears had gathered at the corner of his eyes. He'd always been a man who kept his emotions tightly bound. He never wished for much, and kept his head out of fantasies. The queen never knew because he didn't want his filth to tarnish such a heavenly beauty. I wish I could stay with you, doing your bidding. I wish I could protect you and be your servant. An unworthy man was able to find salvation by dying for his faith. What is there to regret? Thank you, my queen. Wolf, I'll see ya in a minute. Grizzly let loose with his final roar of defiance before the vest detonated. The explosion tore through the tunnel's supports and collapsed a huge section. Sweepers that were too slow to escape were crushed beneath a mountain of rubble.